Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Nations of Charlemagne, the third Kingdom of Burgundy, or rather, the almost third Kingdom of Burgundy. Now, this series is called Nations of Charlemagne, obviously, and our main focus has been on chronicling the histories of France, Germany, and Italy, who are the most obvious countries. However, we've given little bits of information pertaining to the other nations of Charlemagne, namely those lodged between those three countries, who have been obscured and essentially demolished by the grand sweep of history. And of course, I'm referring to Lotharingia in the north, which would in modern day comprise of Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and eastern France. And of course, Burgundy, which corresponds to southern France across the River Rhone, and the western part of Switzerland. Now, the reason we haven't covered this on a major stream is because, obviously thinking about structure, but obviously what we are arriving at the end of the stream, talking about the titular almost third king of Burgundy, is how we start off this narrative talking about how the time when all of these nations were united under a concept known as Lotharingia or Middle Francia. And towards the end of this narrative, history repeats itself towards the end of the 15th century, when it looks for a time as if these new territories are going to amalgamate into this new kingdom, which would launch itself onto Europe as essentially a kingdom rivaling France in terms of manpower, in terms of resources, and perhaps eclipsing all of them in terms of culture. But of course, it never was. So tonight we're going to weave together all of these historical threads, linking all the way back from the Dark Ages when we were doing our stream on the Franks, and relaying it to the time beyond that of our stream last week, which was the 100 Years' War. Very lucky, as always, to be joined by Columba. Hello.
Hello, sir. Good to be here.
And by Marcus Pertinax.
Good evening, everyone, and again, thank you for being here.
How are you two doing this evening?
Very well, yes. It's been a very relaxing day. I was helping a sister with homework, but apart from that, yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, and I've got a nice piping coffee to start my morning here bright and early in Down Under, so I can't complain either.
Wonderful. So the best place to start, I think, is just explaining where the Burgundians start, because this goes all the way back to our stream when we were talking about the Great Migration and the decline of the Roman Empire. So very briefly, Columba, would you like to explain to us where the Burgundians came from?
Essentially, in terms of the name, I think there are two theories that are put forward. The most likely one is that they originated from an island in the sort of the coast of the Baltic Sea, close to Denmark, called, I think, Bornholm, which in Old Norse was Bergenholm or something along those lines. And so that's where the name comes from. There's also I think a Greek writer in the 6th century who refers to the Burgundians as being a tribe more along the lines of, say, the Huns, or a sort of steppe tribe. But regardless of the etymology or the exact origin, they were one of the tribes that crossed the Rhine in 406, along with the Alans and the Suebi, made war on Rome and were settled as allies, foederati, in the area that used to be occupied by Gallic tribes like the Aedui and the Sequani, who, if you've read Caesar's Gallic War, you'll be familiar with them. They settled there as allies, and shortly fell into fighting with Clovis and his expanding kingdom of the Franks. Although they were allied at points as well, like many kingdoms in that period. You see alliances start and break off again, and it's extremely chaotic. But it was during, of course, the collapse of Rome that they were settled, like so many other Germanic tribes.
Yes, and I believe they were settled directly under Flavius Aetius, one of the last great Romans, so to speak. And of course, they were settled in the region which you refer to, the land of the Aedui, or the Sequani, Roman Sequanorum, which is modern day Western Switzerland, the Upper Rhone Valley. Eventually, this territory, obviously emerged as federati, and one of the kings of the Burgundians, King Gundobad, succeeded briefly in becoming one of the major players in the final sort of days of the Roman Empire, after which he became the King of Burgundy. Now, as you mentioned, the future conflict with Clovis, Burgundy was one of the least powerful of the subsequent barbarian kingdoms and was surrounded on all sides by more powerful kingdoms. So on the east, you have the Ostrogothic kingdom, in the west, you have the Visigothic kingdom, and in the north, you have the Merovingian kingdom, the Frankish kingdom under Clovis. And very quickly, under one of Clovis's successors, the Burgundian kingdom is conquered by the Merovingians, and it is incorporated as one of the constituent realms of Greater Francia. So Burgundy doesn't cease to exist. It simply becomes one of the local power bases for all of the constant succession struggles we see among the Merovingians.
Could I just make a quick, interesting point? Because I just recently finished Thomas Carlyle's essay on the Nibelungenlied. And
Nibelungenlied, yeah.
Nibelungenlied. I apologize, my German's atrocious. But he talks about Gundobad's, I think it was Gundobad's son, Gunther, and how he led a raid. And at this time, of course, you have the Burgundians trying to expand into the Visigothic kingdom. But of course, there were sort of folk memories of this period. You had the Romans allied with Attila, and famously the story of the poem, you have Gunther and his Burgundians, and they cross over. I think it's the Rhine. They cross over to go and avenge some wrong, and they're slaughtered, or there's a massive battle at the court of Etzel, who is Attila. So I just wanted to bring that up, that the most famous poem in the sort of the early German canon is set in this sort of heroic period, and in some cases refers to exact events and people.
Well, it's, as you two gentlemen have mentioned, the Burgundian story sort of begins with the collapse and fall of the Roman Empire, certainly the western half of it. And you mentioned, Columba, the origin story of the Nibelungenlied, and that sort of early Germanic medieval poem, and it has its origins with the sort of the birth of the Burgundian story as well. And what's interesting is that the Flavius Aetius actually does form a temporary alliance with the Huns, and it's the Huns in conjunction with the Romans who defeat a small coalition of the Visigoths whom have the Burgundians in league with them. Yet, as we all know, because we have covered this on a previous stream, later the Visigoths and the Burgundians actually sort of allied with Rome to then defeat a burgeoning Hunnic empire under Attila at the Catalonian plains. So it's sort of indicative of this chaotic end period of the West Rome, and the Burgundians are a part in that.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, Burgundy remains as an independent kingdom for a very short time, roughly about 50 years after the collapse of Rome. It's one of the first barbarian kingdoms to be conquered, as we mentioned, by Francia. However, despite its conquest, the fact it was a local power base for these constant contests of the Merovingians for power, and of course, later the Carolingians, after Charles Martel, of course, the Carolingians were exemplified by Charlemagne, the kingdom retained its territorial integrity until, ironically, after the Frankish Empire itself was partitioned. So we're talking a period of about 300 years where Burgundy existed as an entity within Francia. And as part of this, long decline of the Carolingian Empire after the death of Charlemagne, you have the disastrous reign of his son Louis the Pious, and then Lothar, when he becomes emperor in, I believe, 840, is forced to divide the empire up in order to prevent a civil war between his brothers. This is the first time that Burgundy itself is divided, and we're going to see divisions of Burgundy playing a prominent part in this discussion. The domains of Lothar himself, correspond to what would now become Middle Francia, as you can see on this eastern map. Basically, the lands lodged between what we'd now call Germany and the lands on the west, which are now called France. And essentially, as you can see, this is a very interesting idea of a conception of a state. This landmass encompassing Italy in the south, Burgundy in the west, modern-day Lorraine, the west bank of the Rhine, with the exception of the Palatinate, most of Belgium, the Netherlands, and of course Frisia. Well, of course, as you can probably see, this didn't last very long. In fact, this grand conception of Middle Francia only lasted for 12 years. Lothar would die in 855, and Middle Francia will be partitioned again at the Treaty of Prüm, and this time will be partitioned into three. And this is where we see the emergence of what you could say the five nations of Charlemagne. We have East Francia, later Germany in the east. We have West Francia, later France on the west. In the north and the center, we have Lotharingia, of course, which we later rendered as Lorraine. In the south, you have Burgundy, and in the far south, of course, you have the Kingdom of Italy. However, as we're going to discuss, history wasn't very kind to these nascent realms formed out of this tripartite division of Middle Francia. Both Lotharingia and Burgundy would eventually collapse throughout the course of the next few hundred years. So beginning with Lotharingia, does anyone have anything in particular they want to mention about Lotharingia?
Well, I believe it was the case that I believe Lothair II, Lothair's son, died without an heir, and so then Lothair the Elder's two brothers essentially decided to sort of just partition Lotharingia between them, and Lothar was actually the elder brother, and so there was this idea that him being the elder brother, Lotharingia, him receiving these central territories was actually the prestigious option. He received the site that you would have Aachen later, the sort of the central core of Frankish rule went to him. But of course, with the benefit of historical hindsight, we can look at that and say that perhaps he wasn't so lucky.
Yes,
or to some degree, being the older brother too, maybe the prerogative was on him to perhaps quash any quarreling between younger siblings.
Well, yeah, he kept the imperial title, didn't he?
That's correct, yeah. And just as a quick point, because we are talking about sort of the genesis of Burgundy and the origins of some of these kingdoms. Are you able to pop back to the previous slide just very quickly, AM?
Yep.
If you see here on this middle map here, where it sort of lays Alemannia, Burgundy, the Kingdom of the Lombards, already here where the Burgundians have settled in what we'd call Sequania, the Roman Sequania, and what would sort of later become Savoy, you already see sort of this distinction between a Latin sort of sphere and a more Francophone sphere, and even to this day, those borders are almost more or less similar. They're very, very similar to what they are on this map, and you already have this sort of distinction occurring between cultural borders.
Yes, just some points to clarify. The division at Prüm divided the empire among the three sons of Lothar. Lothar was the emperor and ruled over Middle Francia. Louis II became the emperor, but he inherited Italy, Italy being the most prestigious, whereas Lothar II inherited what would later become Lotharingia. And Lotharingia simply means the domain of Lothar. And of course, the idea of, the kingdom of Lothar will live in the titular nomenclature of the Holy Roman Empire all the way up until 1795, and Charles would establish the Kingdom of Provence in the south over the remnants of Burgundy. But as you mentioned, in the north we have Austrasia, being the former heart of Francia, and as Columba mentioned, with the capital of Aachen. And in the south, you have the remnants of historic Burgundy, even though parts of it have now been parceled out to West Francia. And as you mentioned, Columba, this is all sort of brought to a head with the succession crisis when Lothar II dies without a legitimate issue. And of course, the response from the kings of East Francia and West Francia is to dissolve Lotharingia almost immediately. And what we see for the next 100 years is Lotharingia struggling to assert itself within the midst of these constant succession wars as the Carolingian dynasty is declining, in an accelerated rate. And it's seldom do you actually have a ruler of Lotharingia who actually uses Lotharingia as his own power base. One such ruler would be Swetenbogt. However, he was very quickly deposed after ruling for about 5 years. He was the illegitimate son of one of the greater later Carolingian rulers, Arnulf of Carinthia, who we discussed on our Formation of the Holy Roman Empire stream.
Well,
nevertheless,
in terms of their sort of clamoring for independence, it was when Charles the Fat was going to inherit all of these kingdoms, the Lotharingians sort of supported the East Franks in electing Arnulf of Carinthia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly. And that you could say causes the final split of the Carolingian Empire. But of course, Charles the Fat was ultimately deposed from all of his realms because he was uniquely unqualified to rule at a time when the north was being ravaged by the Vikings. So, of course, Arnulf of Carinthia tries to establish one of his sons on the throne of Lotharingia, and he is deposed by the supporters of his half-brother, Louis the Child, who would be the last Carolingian ruler to rule over the East. And in response to this attempt of Lotharingia to basically exert its independence, the Kingdom of Lotharingia is duly abolished. It only exists in part of a, as part of a title, and the rulers over this domain then become the dukes. You have various dukes who try and again exert some form of independence. You have the Regenarid dynasty, which will play an important part in the history of Brabant in particular. They emerge very briefly between 936 and 9 under Otto the Great. Against Otto the Great, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, only to be crushed by him at the Battle of Andernach. And after this, once we have the creation of the Holy Roman Empire in 962, Lotharingia is formally incorporated into the Holy Roman Empire. And as you can see, the borders on the east, those will eventually become the borders of the de jure Kingdom of France and the de jure Holy Roman Empire. In terms of like the eventual disintegration of Lotharingia, Conrad the Red, one of the last, effective rulers of Lotharingia, one of the progenitors of the Salian dynasty, who would later succeed the Ottonian dynasty, rebels against Otto. And this is where we have the dispossession of the duchy and the division of Lotharingia into two, as you can see. So we have Upper Lotharingia, or rather Upper Lorraine, which is ironically in the south, because of course it's referring to the River Rhine and the River Meuse. And of course in the north we have Lower Lorraine, which mostly corresponds to what will eventually become the United Netherlands. Of course, modern day Belgium, Western Germany, and the Northern Netherlands. Now, from 1044 until 1190, the title of, the Duke of Lower Lorraine or Lower Lotharingia exists still, but all political power fragments in this region. The 11th and 12th centuries are a period of rapid decentralization in the Low Countries. Eventually, the Regenarids, who I've already mentioned, a branch of them from the county of Leuven, begin to monopolize this title as the Landgraves of Brabant, and simply the title of Duke of Lower Lotharingia becomes so irrelevant that to compensate for that, the Landgraves of Brabant are simply elevated to the Dukes of Brabant, and they're allowed to use the courtesy title of the Dukes of Lothar and thereafter, and that title remains, and then it becomes subsumed into the titles of the Holy Roman Emperor until 1795. It's during this time that we see the rise of, ecclesiastical authorities, such as the Prince Bishopric of Liège, of Utrecht, the counties of Holland, of Hainaut, the Dukes of Limburg, etc. So what we're witnessing in the north is a complete and utter political disintegration, and we see that the nominal unity of this territory is held on by essentially a worthless title. And in the south, what is known as Upper Lotharingia or Upper Lorraine becomes known at the time as the Duchy of Moselle, and then from the 15th century on, simply as the Duchy of Lorraine. And like its northern counterpart, this too suffers from some internal, disintegration. We see the duchies of Bar becoming independent. We see ecclesiastical authorities such as Verdun, Metz, and Toul all cede away, and they become the so-called three bishoprics. So what we're seeing in the north is a pattern of decentralization, decline, and the absence of any centralized authority, the opposite of what we're going to see in France, ushering in under Philip II Augustus at the very same time. So unless anyone has anything else to say about that in particular, we can move on to the flip side, which is the situation in the south with Burgundy proper.
No, I'm happy to move on.
Sure. So we've talked about the fate of medieval Lotharingia, one of the first nations of Charlemagne to collapse. In the south, we have the situation of the Duchy of Burgundy. Now, please, for members in the audience, do bear with me, because there are many Burgundies, and it might sound a little bit complicated
Yes.
when I try and explain which Burgundy refers to which.
Yes, I've had quite the time of it myself. So
many Burgundies, and they're all much the same. Just different
they're much the
variations
same, and yet they're very different.
Yes.
Legally different, dynastically different. Sometimes you will have ducal Burgundy ruling over the free county or the county Palatine of Burgundy, which itself is part of the Kingdom of Burgundy. All of these increasingly sort of absurd elements, all utilizing the same name of Burgundy, but of course referring to that old ancient territory, as you can see here on the map. Now, as I mentioned, this was one of the regions which was parceled out to Charles of Provence, one of the sons of Lothar I during the Treaty of Prüm. And as with his brother, he dies, and the Carolingian dynasty in Burgundy collapses very quickly. And instead, we see the rise of two new dynasties, the Bossonids or the Bivonids, and the elder house of Wealth, of course, the new house of Wealth we see during the Guelph and the Ghibelline conflicts. The elder house of Wealth will establish a northern kingdom, whereas the Bossonids will establish a southern kingdom, as you can see on the left-hand map. And the Duchy of Burgundy is established under Richard the Justiciar, and it looks for a moment as if out of all three, the Duchy of Burgundy is going to become the richest, the most powerful. It's very effective at dealing with Viking raids. But of course, it, like all of these countries, it falls into a dynastic dispute and eventually becomes incorporated into the now Capetian House of France. And then it's invested with the Capetian dynasty of Burgundy, which will rule there for 300 years forthwith. In the south, the Bossonid dynasty in the south fails, and it's reunited with the north. And this creates the second kingdom of Burgundy. So we had the first kingdom going all the way back to the 5th and 6th centuries. Now we have the second kingdom, and it's known, to posterity as the Kingdom of the Arles, or the Arlat, essentially named after the capital, which is near Aix-en-Provence. And from 932 until 1032, the elder house of Wealth under the kings, typically named Rudolf, would rule over an independent, strong Burgundy, a prosperous Burgundy, until, as we mentioned, with the situation in the north, there is another succession crisis, of which there are so many. I think it's also important to note that during this time, we have the creation of a county of Burgundy in the north. I think it's in the year 982, which is carved out of the Kingdom of Burgundy, which will often be held by the Dukes of Burgundy, just to make things a little bit more complicated for everyone to understand.
Excellent. Absolutely excellent.
Yes.
You also have, once you're getting into 1200, 1100, it's the sort of, peak of ecclesiastical power in Europe. And we've already talked about these things. We've talked about some of the developments at, Cluny, Vézelay, you have Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cluniac movement. All of these things are taking place, and places like Vézelay and Citeaux, these places are all located in Burgundy. So even at this time, it's sort of paving the way in terms of luxury of the courts and of the church, fine art and cloth and all of these things, as well as important theological developments and developments in ecclesiastical structure. All of these things are taking place very early and have a very prominent role to play.
Well, in particular, one of the rulers of this free well, in fact, the history of sort of religion in Burgundy goes all the way back. I mean, one of the successors of Gundobad is, of course, sanctified and made a saint, and he becomes a local saint in this region. And yes, this association with ecclesiastical authority, because, of course, this area is also host to Avignon, which is going to be the site of the later Avignon papacy. So there is a major ecclesiastical presence. But there's also, in terms of why this region is wealthy, why this region is picked out as an important region, it's because it stands on the crossroads between Italy, between Germany and France, essentially. All of Europe travels throughout this region over the course before the emergence of, modern road structures, which we're going to get to towards the end of this discussion. The Rhone is one of the great arteries of Europe in the sense for travel and for trade.
Yes, of course, in the very far south, you have Marseille, which, from ancient Greek times was a great emporium and great trading center of wine and everything. And of course, Burgundy's still famous today for producing wine.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, this situation does not last. The heirless Rudolf III of Burgundy is cajoled by the Holy Roman Emperor, I believe it's Conrad II, because, of course, he is without an heir, to will his kingdom to the Holy Roman Empire upon his death. And of course, that is what happens in 1032. And this establishes you can say in many ways, it could be seen as an advantageous state of affairs for the local population, but also a disastrous state of affairs, where the kingdom becomes established as part of a personal union, essentially, with the then Holy Roman Emperor. But of course, the Holy Roman Emperor and now King of Burgundy will seldom ever pay any attention to this part of his domain, despite its economic and you can say strategic importance being on the border with France. And so essentially you have 300 years, more than 400 years of royal absenteeism where there is no king actually there, and seldom do any of the Holy Roman Emperors actually bother to turn up in Arles and be crowned. There are two notable exceptions to that, one being Frederick Barbarossa, who of course did so during a time of desperation when he was in his constant conflict with the Lombard League in Italy. Of course, Italy was his main source of strategic interest. And right at the end of the existence of the Kingdom of the Isle, you have Charles IV crowning himself, again, as you can say, a last hurrah before the final political disintegration of this period. Because when we're talking about the 11th to the 14th and the 15th centuries, what we see is the carving up of all of the essentially, feudal domains of Arles and being surrendered essentially to foreign powers. Often it's to the main benefit of France, which will eventually include virtually all of this region. Of course, Burgundy today is just a historic regional community, a part of France, so is Provence. The first sort of major example to talk about is the County of Provence in the south, which is, the heart of the kingdom, is where the capital is. It falls first to Catalan rule with the House of Barcelona, and eventually it becomes part of the greater sort of network of French royal houses, essentially, which rule parts of Europe. In this case, it's the Capetian House of Anjou, the same Charles of Anjou who rules over Naples, who puts an end to the Hohenstaufen dynasty. If anything, historically looking back at it, he's the last sort of great hope for the Kingdom of the Isles, the Ararat, establishing some form of political reunification, because he's negotiating with Rudolf von Habsburg, who is now the king of the would-be Holy Roman Emperor, the king of the Germans, that he be given the title, which of course the Holy Roman Emperor is the King of the Isles, in order essentially that he formed an alliance with the Habsburgs, because, we're talking the late 13th century. Charles of Anjou is one of the greatest sort of medieval kings there are. He rules over Sicily, he rules over Naples, he rules over Albania, he rules over Provence, and he's looking as if he's also going to reconquer Constantinople from the nascent Paleologos dynasty at the same time. But of course, all of this is undone when you have the Sicilian Vespers, where Sicily is wrested away from the control of the House of Anjou.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there was a great hatred for them, I suppose. But you mentioned the alliance with the Habsburgs. Was that because they were sort of on the opposite side, if you will, on the eastern side, and so they would have been an opportune ally, or was there some other motive there?
Well, yes. I mean, we're talking about the 1280s here. The Austrians have just won the Battle of Marchfeld against Ottokar of Bohemia, so they've established their power base in the east. If you look at the actual dynastic Habsburg lands, they are just to the northeast of this area. The Castle Habsburg, the original sort of heart of Habsburg power, was in Swabia, just to the northeast of here. So one can see it both as guaranteeing the western portion of the empire, because of course Charles of Anjou making himself king, he would be a king within the Holy Roman Empire. He wouldn't be France annexing the territory, essentially. So ironically, Charles of Anjou will be in the position where he has to defend against his cousins in France, essentially, whilst also protecting the Habsburg lands in further Austria to the west in Swabia.
So it's a similar principle to sort of, I mean, the old alliance, if you attack in this direction, then you'll have another enemy behind you. Classic stuff.
Yes, exactly. But of course, it's not just Provence, which cedes from the titular kingdom of the Isles. The Swiss begin to unite their cantons in the old Swiss Confederacy from the 13th to the 14th century. And then we see the direct territorial annexation by France. So areas such as Vivray and Lyon, which had been, part, as you can see, of Burgundy, are progressively annexed by France. And of course, Lyon becomes the main French city on the Rhone. The Counts of Savoy join up with the basically they form an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, and in response to that, Amadeus V is given what is called imperial immediacy, and what that means essentially he doesn't need to defer to any sort of Aralat institutions. He can just refer himself directly to the emperor. So basically, Savoy is established as an independent county within the empire, not having to pay any heed to the fact it was formerly part of the Aralat. And again, if you look at Savoy on this map, Savoy is right at the heart, combined with the lands in Switzerland. These are the ancient areas in which the Burgundians were first settled. So the heartland of the Kingdom of Burgundy is now being sundered away from it. So essentially, it's beginning to lose all political relevance. And the you can say the coup de grace in terms of the disintegration of the kingdom is when the Dauphin region, which is north of Provence, is sold to Philip VI of France, which of course we discussed on our previous stream. And of course, that was given to a title and a territory, which was given to the heir of the Kingdom of France in perpetuity. And as I said before, Charles IV goes to Arles to be crowned in a desperate attempt to shore up this, completely and utterly dwindling authority. In the Golden Bull of 1356, you see various authorities such as the Archvicar of Arles, all of these positions which are awarded. But ultimately, there is no political significance to this. This is all, this is all just awarding titles and political authority, which doesn't simply exist. So after this point, from the death of Charles IV in particular, the last ever crowned king of Burgundy, the Kingdom of Burgundy, the Kingdom of Arles, just becomes part of the grand imperial epithet, essentially. There is no political or cultural unity to this region anymore. It simply exists, as we see in the north with the Duchy of Lothar. The Kingdom of Burgundy is simply reduced to a title, and here we have the death of another nation of Charlemagne.
Yeah, certainly. I'm afraid my my knowledge doesn't extend to this sort of strange in between period, though. I mean, I know that you have the transfer to Philip the Bold, who is the heir, and then that leads to many problems. But that's what 50 or 100 years after this.
Oh, that's much later. This is when we get to the run up to the Third Kingdom. But yes, I think it's just because again these are two regions which we mentioned briefly on our other streams. But I think it's important just to reference the fact, had history turned out differently, these were regions which historically maintained a political and cultural significance throughout the majority of the medieval ages. Yet I'm sure most of our audience are probably unaware of these two regions, and of course the significance which they'll play in terms of the nation building, the myth making of Philip the Good and Charles the Bold some 100 years later. So Marcus, unless you have anything you would like to say, we can get on to have just a brief discussion about the state of the medieval Netherlands before we arrive at the House of Valois Burgundy.
No, I'm good to continue on. Let's proceed.
Wonderful. So Columba, do you have anything you want to start off with when it come to the medieval Netherlands?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, looking at the maps of this period, you have these sorts of even earlier on, when you have the Frankish Empire still, you have Neustria and Austrasia, but then in the Netherlands, there's this sort of extreme, even by the standards of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, this extreme tendency towards decentralization, and you have all of these little tiny states. I don't know. I think it might be something to do with the landscape, or the constant flooding that perhaps makes centralization difficult. But yes, it's an extremely sort of scattered policy. You don't polity or large group of polities.
Yes, just to clarify on this map I've got up here, of course it is in Dutch, if that causes a bit of confusion, but I think most of the names can be made out. This region corresponds to Imperial France the Empire and the Kingdom of France. So the area we have in the southwest here, Artesian, which of course is Artois, is part of France, and Vlaanderen, which of course is Flanders, is part of France at the same time. However, this map is basically corresponding to what would later become the 17 provinces, when we finally see the emergence of a consolidated legal entity, which is the Netherlands. But of course, the Netherlands is not a nation of Charlemagne. The Netherlands is a creation of the 16th century, born out of the political failure of Lotharingia, which basically establishes the situation, and the long-term consequences of the Burgundian succession, which we'll get to. But just in terms of like a broad overview, because we've already talked about the political situation which brought us here, it is during this period that we begin to see the emergence of a distinct Dutch series of dialects, not a Dutch language. Again, much of what we now know as modern Dutch is going to arrive in the the 16th century. But we see the emergence of distinct Middle Dutch dialects, Flemish, Hollandic, Brabantian. The Cleveland's dialect, of course, referring to this area around Western Germany, just west of Aachen, where there still isn't this great sort of cultural distinction between what it means to be Dutch and what it means to be German. You also see the emergence of minstrel culture, written culture in the Dutch vernacular for the first time around the end of the 12th century, because of course beforehand now all language had been written in Latin principally. We begin to see great Dutch romances such as the Aeneas romance, which even though it's the only surviving transcript of it, ironically, is in Middle German. I believe there are Dutch renditions of it by such writers as von Velderke. And here we begin to see the emergence of a distinct lowland culture. And you mentioned, why this region in particular, why is it so sort of politically decentralized? Well, of course, the Romans never bothered to cultivate it such because it was a swampy marshland, essentially. We have very little in terms of like Roman cities here or any sort of long-lasting sort of evidence of Roman civilization. When you're looking to the great Roman cities, they are around this area. They're to the south, cities such as Alesia or Lugdunensis, and then in the east you have cities such as Trier and cities such as Cologne. But within this area, you have very little in terms of long-lasting Roman impression. So
well,
that
I think
makes
the people in the area, going all the way back to the Batavians, were granted an unusual amount of freedom, and of course, with that freedom came a lack of development. So I think you're onto something there.
Well, the irony, of course, is the region we're talking about was the first land grant, essentially, by the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate to the Salian Franks was in this province as well. So combine that and the the Batavian riots, will later become the Frisian Freedom. This area is very unruly, very underdeveloped, and will remain so until we finally get to this period in which, almost by magic, it is transformed into one of the most urbanized and economically rich and strong manufacturing centers in Europe. Just to go a bit on the language, of course, it's during this time that we see the arrival of the so-called Mosan art, which is the Meuse River Valley sort of derived element of Romanesque, and of course this will later blossom into the early sort of Flemish Renaissance when we sort of transcend from the Gothic movement. Just to mention, these rise of these new urban centers accompanying the rise of a new class, the Bürgerliche in German. Bruges, in the county of Flanders, which of course is de jure part of France, emerges as one of the wealthiest cities in Europe at this time. We've alluded to on previous streams. This is in part due to trade and access to wool. And in addition to this, we have major cities such as Tournai, we have Ypres, we have Ghent, we have Brussels, and we have Antwerp. These cities benefit from being on the periphery of Hanseatic influence, so there is that trading connection there. In addition, we see the importation of Italian elements of merchant capitalism, banking, etc. Antwerp later on will become the site of one of the first stock exchanges. And you mentioned the swamplands, but of course it's during this time that we see the cultivation and the drainage of these swamplands, which leaves far more land to develop these new sort of urban centers essentially out of nowhere. And the effect of the creation of all of these new urban centers is that we have many cities which are basically independent of aristocratic authority, which have city rights, self-government. Basically, they're quasi-independent republics. And these are the vehicles through which the Netherlands is going to become a major center of trade and manufacturing.
I mean, the land is also extremely productive, is it not? In many places where they reclaim and build these holders and what have you. Even today, the agricultural produce of the Netherlands is remarkably disproportionate to its size. But I was wondering, just quickly, because of course you have all of these connections between the area that would become the Netherlands and going all the way south until we get to Burgundy and Marseille. I imagine, in addition to the sort of naval traffic, a variety of goods would have been transported overland along that route as well.
Yes, I mean the main
in their growth.
I mean, the main sort of thoroughfares, of course, we're talking about the rivers. The main rivers in this region, of course, are the Rhine. So this making the Netherlands one of the main thoroughfares from maritime trade into Germany. But also we have the Meuse, which, of course, is a major conduit into France at the same time. So the presence of these rivers makes trading significantly easier. But of course, when we get to the late 13th and the 14th century, this region's geographic location is going to be very significant in terms of trade between England and the continent in particular. And that is why, you know, Flanders in particular will become very entwined with the fate of England economically.
Yes, I mean, you have Van Dyck and stuff as well. I mean, it's basically a sort of, in many ways, a sort of strange outpost of England in that period. All the Flemish artists and craftsmen are all going to work for the English kings. But anyway.
Well, you both sort of touched on from a sort of a trade and economic standpoint. I mean, let's sort of consider the fact that what would become the Netherlands sits as, you know, in between the French kingdom and what was the HRE and the large number of German states. Like you said, apostolic. The mouths of the Rhine and the Meuse run through the Netherlands. It sits almost opposite the Kingdom of England and would later become Great Britain. And from sort of the end of the Middle Ages onwards, this becomes a very important sort of nexus of trade. Think also that it sits to the west of what was the Hanseatic League. And this preeminence of the Netherlands as a trade hub sort of begins in this phase we're talking about now in a time context.
I mean, I imagine they also, I mean, you know, going back to my Caesar, he describes tribes that live in this area as being exceptional in their sort of naval knowledge. And I imagine that kind of expertise came to bear in their trading activities as well.
Oh, doubtless. I mean, that's why, for instance, you know, going forward in time, the Netherlands becomes one of the sort of preeminent maritime powers and exploration powers of the era of discovery, you know, from the 15 and 1600s. But that's a bit out of our time from here.
Yes. So anyway, alluding back to some of the elements in our previous stream, obviously Flanders becomes one of the richest possessions, you know, of France, albeit they're fighting for their autonomy due to this awkward political situation arising out of the creation of these new urban centers and free cities. And so from the beginning of the 13th century until the beginning of the 14th century, we have 100 years of on and off conflict, or rather you could say it even goes beyond that. In 1214, I believe, we have the Battle of the Bovine. And of course, we have the Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle, which is during the reign of Philip IV. All of these attempts to force Flanders to become, you know, recognized as part of France. And of course, as we mentioned on our previous stream, without repeating too much, Flanders is going to be one of the hotspots of contention between the English and French vying over influence. Essentially, you have a mercantile class which basically supports England, and you have a very unpopular count who basically supports France, who is of course going to be the progenitor of the, you know, the rise of the Valois Burgundians, as we're going to get into. In addition to this, of course, now we're going into the Holy Roman Empire. The strongest aristocratic power in the south was of course the Brabantine dukes, and of course they held on to the title of Lothair, that titular remnant of Lotharingia, and they would gradually, as you can see, accumulate land in the center between Netherlands and Belgium, essentially. You know, in the north we have Breda, in the south we have the area corresponding to Brussels. They would eventually try and monopolize the political and, you know, trade relationship over the Overmaas, or the Trans-Meuse region, again mentioning the political significance and economic significance of all of these mainstream rivers. In the north,
also the mouth of the Rhine.
The mouth of the Rhine is in
Zeeland there.
Yes, in Zeeland. And Zeeland doesn't fall to Brabant. Zeeland is forcefully eventually annexed by the County of Holland, which moves on to the heart of power in the north, which of course is the County of Holland. And like Normandy, the County of Holland was basically a Viking principality. It had been established by a Viking chieftain named Rorik during the 9th century, and would eventually come to, you know, obviously not only dominate that region, but become the foremost component of the modern day nation of the Netherlands. This, of course, would be the site of various succession struggles throughout the 14th and the 15th century. And, you know, at one point, there was even a Dutchman who was elected as King of the Romans, the would-be Holy Roman Emperor. And this is, of course, William II of Holland, who was elected as an anti-king. And he plays a interesting role in the relationship with this northern area, the so-called lands of Frisia. This had been one of the most rebellious parts of the Frankish realm, and essentially it had become, albeit politically independent very early on, even before the creation of Middle Francia. The Frankish rule over this region, the far north of the Netherlands and Western Germany, was only ever nominal. And by we're talking about the 13th century, they had been able to evict and often kill any attempt of a aristocrat to impose their authority over this region, including Henry the Margrave in 1101. And various attempts were made by the neighboring county of Holland to impose some form of aristocratic rule in this region. But eventually they were forced, this is William II, the anti-king, forced into a position where they have to recognize basically the free and you could say almost plebeian nature of rule in what was called the Frisian freedom, essentially. And this would be, this independence will be fought for, right up until the 16th century. And these privileges would, often be, bestowed by future emperors such as Sigismund. And then there'll be attempts by, say, for example, Louis the Bavarian, who we've mentioned on our Great Interregnum stream, to wrestle these privileges away as he would try and establish an independent Bavarian power base in the Low Countries throughout the 14th century.
I see. I wonder how they were so successful in that endeavor. Is it just that all of these big players around them had better things to do than try and take Frisia, or were they militarily quite talented, or were they just lucky?
Well, there is no. I mean, apart from Denmark, there is very little in the way of like a strong power there. I mean, the strongest power, of course, up there used to be the Duchy of Saxony, but the Duchy of Saxony had been politically sort of disintegrating along with all of these other duchies, moving towards the east. But then it had, of course, been reconsecrated as a Frankish stem duchy. But nevertheless, this was in decline. So there really is no sort of contender for power along this region apart from the local counts of Holland, and of course. Louis XIV would be chided essentially, for his attempt to wrestle control over this region. He would be one of the few rulers from without to try and establish imperial domination. And he would, of course, do so by placing various members of the House of Wittelsbach onto the thrones of Zeeland, onto the thrones of Holland, onto the thrones of Hainaut. And this would lead to the so-called Hook and Cod Wars. These broad factions from the
familiar. I've heard yes. I think I read about this in the Sun.
Well, if that's a true Sun headline, because I don't remember that's actually a brilliant headline, because there is a historical allusion there, but I doubt they were that
well,
clever.
If they did make that allusion, I'm sure it was just a coincidence.
But yes, it dates back to this ancient attempt by Bavaria to try and impose some form of control over this region. And other than Bavaria trying to control Holland, you have the bishopric of Utrecht constantly at odds with the county and later Duchy of Gelders. So it's just, and of course you have the major Duchy of Prince Bishopric of Liège in the south. It's just complete bedlam essentially for most of the Middle Ages, and
Liège,
it's very
especially. I mean, Liège comes into consideration far later as well. It seems to always be a bit of a troublemaker. You're reading the history, and every month there's a revolt in Liège.
Yes, absolutely. Liège will be one of the most rebellious components of the Burgundian Netherlands, essentially their attempts to impose authority. So without further ado, we're 45 minutes in. We can finally get to the rise of the almost kingdom, the third kingdom of Burgundy, with the rise of the House of Valois Burgundy. So anything you want to say about this in particular, Columba or Marcus?
Not right now, but give me a couple of minutes once you've set the scene so admirably.
Yes, well, I'm rather probably the weakest of the three about in terms of this period and this geography, so I'm willing to just listen and learn myself.
Wonderful. So, well, just to give a quick backstory, of course, going back to our little talk on the Kingdom of Arles, Burgundy was divided into three. And on the west, you had the Duchy of Burgundy. On the east, you had the Imperial Kingdom of the Arles. And this little remnant, which was, the Duchy of Burgundy, at one point it looked as if it would become more or less an independent duchy, paying heed to the Carolingian rulers in France. Of course, this was not the case because, as virtually the constant thread throughout this narrative, a succession crisis ended that, and Burgundy was briefly restored to the French monarchy under, I think it was King Henry I, one of the most ridiculed of the French kings for being one of the most impotent, and he would bestow the Duchy of Burgundy upon one of his brothers, Philip. And Philip would and his progeny would basically rule over Burgundy for the next 300 years, creating the Capetian House of Burgundy. Among other things, that house would also come to rule Portugal at some point, but that's neither here nor there. After 300 years of rule, so we're talking 1032 until 1361. Similar story. This falls to another succession crisis. The last Duke of Burgundy, as part of the ancient Capetian House of Burgundy, dies at the age of 15, and he's already been betrothed to, I think, the 11-year-old Margaret III, of the heiress of Flanders, and therefore one of the richest heiresses in Europe. So with the premature death of Philip, the duchy, for the first time in over 300 years, reverts back to the King of France. Because of anyone who doesn't understand why that happens, essentially, when a monarch bestows a fiefdom or an appanage upon either a relative or a notable vassal, if the line were to fail, essentially because all of these lands are part of the legal domain of France, the King of France has the right to inherit that domain back.
Yes,
if
the law of reversion.
Yes, the law of reversion, exactly, Columba. And so this is what happens with, and of course, this is important because we'll deal with the ultimate succession crisis at the end of the stream. Reversion is what happens to Burgundy. It reverts back to John II. You can say one of the tiny spots of good luck for John II, given the disaster of his reign, which we were chronicling
yes, he's
last
not having
week.
a good time. No, I mean, we have the 100 Years' War, yes. And then he gives it to his I think his son, Philip. Philip
yes,
the Bold.
his not Philip the Bold, Charles the Bold. Oh yes, well, sometimes he's known as Philip the Bold to make things more confusing. But I think just for the sake of the continuity of the discussion, we'll just call him Philip II because it might confuse.
And then sometimes we'll have Philip the Bold and then Philip the Bald as well, just to make it easier,
Yes, all of these wonderful epithets deriving from the Carolingian period. How wonderful! They stay with us this entire period, don't they? But yes, in terms of why this man in particular is significant among all the others. Philip II is incredibly prudent in terms of the long game of diplomatic marriages. Of course, as we're going to discuss on our stream next week, the Habsburgs are the ones who ultimately perfect the system of the diplomatic marriage. But here in Burgundy, with Philip II, we see the beginning of this grand expansion of the state through the utilization of marriage. Because Philip II, of course, marries the widow of the previous duke, not only to bolster his position as duke, but also because, as I mentioned, Margaret of Flanders is not only was her marriage never consummated, but is one of the richest heiresses in Europe. Essentially, by the year 1384, when her closest male relative, her father, dies, she inherits Flanders. She inherits Navarre, which is just west of Burgundy. She inherits the Free County of Burgundy, this part of Burgundy which was created out of the Kingdom of the Isle in the east. We see the unification of Artois, the lands of Burgundy. So we're talking about the lands just north of the Somme River, and the Rethellois, which is just south of Liège and west of Luxembourg. So what we're seeing now with the this marriage between Philip II and Margaret of Flanders, in addition, of course, to Flanders itself, which is the prize of all of these inherited places, we're beginning to see an empire on the eastern and northern borders of France, which rivals the territories of the King of France himself in terms of wealth and prestige and power.
And I do think that empire is a good word to use, because one of the sort of defining features that you see in these possessions is that there is no, overall defining sort of ethnos. It like say in France or England, it's a hodgepodge, a sort of collection of different peoples. And in the north, as we've mentioned, more so, you have city to city vast differences.
Yes, yes, Marcus, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's interesting here is, sorry, just 2 seconds. What's interesting here is that with this marriage that occurs and this sort of gradual sort of culmination of this sort of Burgundian rebirth. If you look at the geography of it, with the incorporation of Artois and parts of Flanders and the sort of Burgundian portions in the south, you almost have this sort of beginnings of almost a reformation of Carolingian Lotharingia. It's not the same. Obviously, the territories aren't reflective 100%, but you know what I mean? Like, these sort of powers reconstituting in this old Lotharingian territories, and again, they're establishing a hegemony of their own that is separate from France and from the HRE at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you can even see some continuity if you look at the old Roman provinces. It's essentially sort of a combination of Germania Inferior or Germania Secunda, I think it got called later on, and then also Gallia Belgica, which sort of reached down into that area, the sort of north of Burgundy, perhaps, not Provence, but above there. And so I suppose on one half of things, you have a sort of conscious attempt or somewhat conscious attempt to reclaim these areas. And then on the other side, it's happenstance, and then also this habit, this pattern, which we've mentioned before, that you see of sort of blocks of civilization existing because of trade and geography. They create these areas where power tends to concentrate, and you see it again and again.
Yes, just to push back against that slightly. I mean, one of the other historical parallels one can draw, of course, is the just to go early on the map here. As you can see on this middle map, look at Austrasia. That very closely again corresponds, even with its boundary at the Somme, with the territories of Picardy, Artois, Valois, and Flanders, which are going to become the basis for what will become the Burgundian Empire in the Netherlands. So there are these, lingering sort of elements of statehood which continue throughout this period. And again, this is spanning hundreds of years of history, not just the continued existence of Middle Francia, but I don't believe at this precise moment, again, there is that much of a conscious conception about the revival of Lotharingia.
Yes, I was skeptical about saying that. I didn't want to overstate it.
Yes, that comes much better. And of course, I think what's important about, talking about these figures in particular, the emergence of the House of Valois Burgundy, is we have been chronicling utter political disintegration in these regions, the disintegration of power in both in Burgundy and in Lotharingia. So what we're seeing now, apart from, the Capetian House of Burgundy would often be ad hoc in personal union with the county of Burgundy on the eastern side, the state which has its capital in Dole, and of course in the west you have the Duchy of Burgundy with its capital in Dijon. So basically, this upper Rhone Valley region would periodically be united under the Capetian House of Burgundy. But we're discussing something more than that. We're discussing the House of Burgundy branching out into the Netherlands for the first time. And at the moment we're covering all of the territories which are still de jure part of France. But as we're going to see, the ambitions of Philip the Bold and moving on to his grandson are much greater than that, and they're going to be constantly expanding eastwards into this power vacuum, because the Holy Roman Empire concurrently with this period is also entering a period of great decline. This is the period of the Great Interregnum, essentially. The Holy Roman Emperors who are effective during this period, such as Louis of Bavaria, are very few and far between, and his legacy in the Low Countries only lasts, less than a century before it's completely undone by the encroachments of Burgundy. And then
there's a sort of vacuum there.
Yes, there is an imperial vacuum in authority, and the Eastern emperors, the emperors after Louis IV, one of the few emperors to show any interest in this region whatsoever. We have the emperors based in Bohemia, the emperors based in Austria, the emperors based in Hungary. So further, the imperial lands, the imperial center of power, the focal point of their interest is ever moving eastwards, away from this territory. And ironically, it is only going to be the creation of a Burgundian empire which reestablishes that interest between the empire, in this case the House of Habsburg, and the remnant of Burgundy. And that's ultimately, the culmination of what we're talking about. But just before we get there, going back to the marriage policy of Philip II and his, conscious, empire building, so to speak. Once we have the annexation of Flanders, he then, formally imposes Burgundian rule on the region on behalf of his wife, defeating a a burger leader, Artevelde, at the Battle of Ghent. And again, just to point to all these names, you mentioned the linguistic difference. Of course, Flemish has much more roots with Western Germanic Dutch than it does with French, and obviously the eastern regions, the southern regions, Wallonia are much more French speaking, these regions. So we're talking about a linguistically and culturally diverse region, which is united dynastically. There is very little, as you mentioned, Columba, in terms of cultural or linguistic unification in these territories. They are united behind the person of the Duke. Yes. And the Duke is
sort of, sorry, I was just going to say that it's that sort of friction between the sort of Francophile aristocracy and the sort of more Germanic people that leads to so many problems, and also leads to repeated English interference and what have you.
Yes, well, not just Francophile aristocracy; they are French, literally French aristocracy. Philip is the son of a king of France, and he is the brother of another king of France, and he is the regent and uncle of another. But of course, this sets again the tenor of how the Burgundians are going to rule. They're very anxious to assert their sovereignty, yet at the same time, they want to promote the various privileges of these great cities in Flanders, be they Bruges, be they Ypres, be they Ghent, simply for the purpose that this is seen as a way to cultivate a profitable relationship with these cities. They let the merchants make their money so long as they acknowledge the Burgundians essentially as their overlords. And this is going to be a policy which...
You see similar policies in other countries at the time. In England, for example, you'll see slightly later kings like Edward and even Richard, they take steps to increase their authority, but they also grant privileges to important cities like York for this exact reason that they recognize the increasing power of this middle class and they want to sort of court it.
Yes, exactly. So back to this discussion of the marriages. If anything can exemplify this policy of the dynastic marriage policy, it's the double wedding at Cambrai. Building upon what I've mentioned earlier about the Hook and Cod Wars and the Bavarian encroachments, Philip the Bold marries his son John the Fearless and his daughter Margaret into the Wittelsbach family of Holland and Hainaut, and from there we have the claims essentially establishing Burgundian, royal links to all of these territories across the Netherlands, commencing at this double wedding at Cambrai. In addition, he's thinking even further than this. He's thinking to potential alliances with other powers in this, in the East in particular. So he forms an alliance with Savoy through marriage. He forms an alliance with Austria through marriage. So right from the beginning, having established this dynastic empire by right of his wife, Margaret of Flanders, we're seeing that Philip is probably the first one who's envisaging a future empire in the East. He's very interested, of course, in rules in France. Of course, he rules France for the large part of 20 years, but he's also thinking about the long-term sort of aspirations of his dynasty outside of France at the same time. And this sort of, you can say, this conflict between whether we are French or whether we are something else is going to be something which plagues his successors. And this is where we get to John the Fearless, who are only very briefly mentioned because his story plays a large part of the 100 Years' War, but he does very little in terms of actually expanding the direct holdings of the House of Burgundy in the East. So, of course, in 1404, Philip the Duke dies. His mother dies the year after in 1405, and John the Fearless inherits this new empire. In addition to, expanding these domains, Anthony, John's younger brother, he is given essentially the Duchy of Brabant by a will after his great aunt dies, and this establishes the House of Burgundy in the Duchy of Brabant. So for the first time, the Dukes of Burgundy now also hold the title of the Duke of Lothar, linking back to the old Lotharingian heritage. However, in terms of
prestigious title.
Yes, and of course, it's, you can say, the key to the center of the Netherlands at the same time. Nevertheless, in terms of like the long-lasting implications of this, it establishes the Burgundian influence on Brabant. But Anthony and his brother Philip II, the Count of Nevers, are both killed at Agincourt for unwisely defying John's prohibition on joining the Armagnac faction to fight the English.
Yeah, because the majority of the Burgundians sat it out, didn't they?
Yes, but of course the two of the most prominent Burgundians joined in the battle and were personally killed. And this, of course, begins with the long intervention of John in France. He basically controls France from 1415 until 1418. We have this, again, in addition to the civil war with the Armagnac faction, what do we do with the English in the north? On the one hand, John is very economically dependent on the English due to the trading relationship with Flanders. Yet at the same time, he has now positioned himself as protector of the King of France. He doesn't want to expend Burgundian resources fighting the English, so he basically allows them to conquer the north. So he's basically, biding his time, thinking, which side is going to come out on top. And of course, before we see what would have happened, had the English finally approached Paris, he is murdered by companions of the Dauphin Charles during an aborted attempt again to parley. He's paying off both sides at the same time, and in this case to his own detriment, because the Dauphin's entourage accuses him of treason at the bridge of Montereau, and of course this leads to his death. And we arrive at the you can say the golden age of Burgundy, which is under Philip III the Good. Columba, is there anything you want to say on Philip III?
Well, does Philip not inherit further territories? Like he inherits Holland as well.
Yes, it's quite a bit more complicated than that, almost slightly more interesting than simply a matter of inheritance, because rather than this being a haphazard system of almost luck by inheritance, there is a very conscious policy which Philip the Good is pursuing when it comes to the Netherlands. So Philip III obviously inherits his position in France from his father. His father had basically been protector of the realm after the annihilation of the Armagnac faction in Paris and the felling of a great number of them at the Battle of Agincourt. And Philip III now, obviously his faction is temporarily, irreconcilable to peace with the Dauphin faction because of the murder of his father. So Philip III is essential in making the temporary English, personal union with France possible. He is the one who officiates at the Treaty of Troyes, which acknowledges Henry V as the heir to the current King Charles VI. And of course, we mentioned what happened there. And of course, to bolster this alliance with the English, he marries his sister to John, the Duke of Bedford, who of course becomes the regent of France in 1522 after the death of Henry V. Now, back to your question of his policy regarding marriage and inheritance. What he essentially does is cajole and essentially he uses his claims, which had been established during the original marriage compact at Cambrai, to essentially force these various claimants into a position where they have to sell their titles to him, and therefore he can expand his domain. So the first one is Nemours, which of course is in eastern Belgium, is gained through purchase. The ruler of Holland, of Zeeland, of Hainaut during this time was Jacqueline of Bavaria, and she had famously married, some of the most notable aristocrats in Europe in an attempt to find, first of all, produce an heir, but shore up her tenuous position in the Netherlands. Rather than, wait for her to die, essentially, she was constantly, almost on the point of bankruptcy. She was constantly short of funds. So essentially, using his, incredible wealth from Flanders and from Burgundy, the Duke basically forces her to pawn off her realms to him, essentially, and forces her to, by treaty, surrender Holland, surrender Zeeland, surrender Hainaut in 1433. And this, of course, he basically does that so she can have a guaranteed income for 3 years in which she dies and the issue of the succession is gone. Going back to, having established the House of Burgundy on the Sea to Brabant, that line, the line of Antony, fails when we have the death of Philip of St. Paul. And Philip then inherits Brabant at the same time, in addition to Limburg. Now, looking at this map here, which is the map I have of what would later become the Third Kingdom of Burgundy under the reign of his son Charles, you can see he's basically snaking the entirety of the Netherlands, with the exception of the extreme northeast, the remnants of the Frisian freedom. So essentially, he is anxiously consolidating a continuous territorial empire in the Netherlands, one of which has not been seen, since we go back to the map here, since the original unification under Lower Lotharingia, all the way back in the 11th century. So this is a conscious policy of empire building. He's selecting certain provinces which he has a claim to because of their economic and strategic utility in building this great dynastic empire out of the Low Countries.
And of course, using his increasingly fantastic wealth to do it, making offers that can't be refused, I suppose. But speaking more generally about the culture of the time, that vast wealth, of course, comes to play here. We have Flemish primitivism, which is the term that's tossed around, and it's the sort of first bloom or the first hints of the Renaissance in the north. And it's remarkable that 100 years before, you don't really see anything of the sort in the Netherlands and in the northern regions. Then all of a sudden you have this fantastic blooming of fine arts. I mean, you have a picture of Jan van Eyck there, who's, I mean, one of the greatest painters ever. I mean, I think Kenneth Clark in his Civilization, he writes that portrait painting and realism came to an immediate perfection in the north, and it's hard to disagree with them, because I mean, and of course, all of these artists are catering not only to people like Philip, but to this massively new powerful new mercantile class. And so you have amazing portraits. You have the Arnolfini portrait, which is by Van Eyck, and depicts an Italian merchant, Arnolfini, who of course is hawking wares, hawking cloth up this stretch between the south and then the north, and all of these men are vastly wealthy. And I mean, the use of extreme realism in the portraiture, but also the use of light, it anticipates someone like Vermeer in the 1600s. It's remarkably advanced for the time. The work with reflections, the way metal's done, the way fabric is drawn, and in terms of sort of the reason for this extreme delicacy and depth of the work, I would say that it probably comes from the tradition of sort of cloth. Because I mean, if you look to the south, when you have the sort of genesis of Renaissance painting, people like Giotto, who we've also talked about, they're basically expanding Byzantine forms, and so they're expanding composition, and the compositions are becoming ever more complex and fine, and perhaps more dynamic than the compositions in the north, but they just don't have that depth. The techniques are, painting on tempera, on wood, or fresco. Whereas in the north, you have Van Eyck, who is supposed to have invented classical oil painting. And I think that the focus on craftsmanship and cloth, especially, and the sort of patience that weaving cloth takes, and that sort of culture of extremely fine craftsmanship promoted or created men like Van Eyck. And then you also have Der Weyden, who did a wonderful series of portraits. He did Philip the Good, and then he also did a portrait of his son Charles the Bold, who we'll come to. But you'll notice here the style of the composition perhaps isn't as dynamic as you'll see, but in terms of the detailing and in terms of the depiction of cloth itself, it's minutely exact. And so stunning developments, and of course all supported by the massive wealth of the duchy.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned how the cloth trade, relates in particular to this, and of course these are originally, we're talking about the early 15th century. These are merchants who are, innovating, who are paying for these various commissions. And it's not just painting, even though, you can argue that the northern developments in painting are superlative. Although I would argue there is a tradition in Flemish painting. We start with the Morand, the Meurs style, we move into the international Gothic style, and then we arrive at this, again, you can almost say derisively called from a, art historian point of view, primitivism. But nevertheless, it is the blossoming of you could say again, the perfection of portraiture. But it's not just in portraiture. I mean, we have the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, who is a contemporary of this period. Slightly later, he comes to his culmination during the Habsburg period. But again, the creation of the still life and the early sort of the Flemish Renaissance painting we see in the late 15th century, the early 16th century. All of these facets of painting, are exemplified. You can say reach their zenith under the Flemish and the Dutch schools.
Yeah, it's certainly a sort of an in-between period, isn't it? Because someone like Bosch, is obviously drawing much more from Gothic tradition, from even some of the absurd and the grotesque that you see in manuscripts, whereas someone like Van Eyck is tracking in this new direction. Although, of course, he would still wear the sort of medieval chaperones. Although even the chaperones have reached a point of extravagance, as we can see here.
Yes, and I mean, it's not just painting. We're talking about the innovations in jewelry in particular. I mentioned the Dutch connection to manufacturing. We're also talking about the importation. I mean, silk in particular. Philip of Burgundy was obsessed with silk. He would pay exorbitant amounts to style this new extravagant clothing based on silk. Say, for example, we have the patronage of these amazing tapestries, these illuminated manuscripts, essentially, which were popularized throughout Europe, which helped make the court of Burgundy the center of taste and style and fashion to be imitated throughout all of Europe. In this sense, the Duke of Burgundy was wealthier and more influential than the vast majority of kings throughout all of Europe at a time when the Holy Roman Empire is basically, politically decentralized and collapsed. A minor duke, even though he would style himself as the Grand Duke of the West, is leading the way in terms of artistic style. I mean, we have the patronage network, which is set up by the city bourgeoisie, the Bürgerliche. But with Philip, we see it entering into this grand opulence, which of course puts all of these minor patrons to shame. And of course, the effect of the court around Philip at the same time is that many benefactors of the court are wealthy enough to patronize these artists as well. So you mentioned Arnolfini and Van Eyck. Another famous patron of Van Eyck was Nicolas Rollin, who was the chancellor of Philip for roughly about 30 years during his long reign in the Netherlands. And of course, I've used the most famous commission, the Madonna and Chancellor Rollin here as the thumbnail for this work, exemplifying that melding of secular authority, this patronage, and the rising state of Burgundy and these various courtiers. But combined with this, it's not just the artistic patronage of the fine arts, which we've gone into quite a lot here. There is also the patronage of music, in particular. So this is the period of you could say the creation of Renaissance music as we know it would later become Baroque music. We have Guy Binchois, we have Gilliam Dufay, pioneers of the again. They'll give it that Burgundy will be the name of this school, essentially, which creates modern music in a sense, which is incredible to think. And again, all of these people patronized directly by the Duke of Burgundy. But this leads into.
Sorry, but I was just going to say, in terms of this opulence, it's not just. It's a massive source of power as well in this period. Whenever there's a coronation, whenever there's a wedding, whenever a king enters a city that he's been away from for a long time, there are, processions, and the tapestries are hung out in the streets, and the king even travels, usually with a body of these musicians, and so it's all sort of projecting power. And in this age, in the early 1400s, this is the beginning of the age of diplomacy proper. We have people like Commines or Commons who writes his account of Philip and Charles's reign. We have Machiavelli in Italy, and we have these diplomats who will go to another kingdom and then report back to their king about the splendor of the court, report back to the people. And these things are all becoming increasingly important. And so there's this increasing pressure to present yourself as in as majestic a manner as possible. And so it has real political considerations as well as economic and artistic.
Yes, and I would say in terms of the real political significance, you can mention the establishment of the Order of the Golden Fleece. And of course, the Order of the Golden Fleece wasn't unique in the sense that it was this newly found chivalric knightly order. I mean, the Order of the Garter had been established nearly 100 years earlier by Edward. John II had failed to create an order, the Order of the Star, to imitate the Order of the Garter. But the Order of the Golden Fleece in particular was unique in that the Duke was desperately trying to associate his court not just with wealth, but with knightly chivalry, the ideal essentially of knightly chivalry. I mean, in terms of this patronage of the arts, you can say that there is a predecessor in recent history with one of his cousins, the Duke of Berry, some 50 years earlier. However, the Duke of Berry was disinterested in politics. There wasn't a martial aspect to him in the same way there was with Philip of Burgundy. Philip of Burgundy was combining this martial aspect with this artistic aspect, and with the establishment of the Order of the Golden Fleece. I mean, it's more than just aesthetic. It's more than just imitating the values of chivalry. This order had political significance. it had the right of consultation on the Duke. In the case of war, it functions essentially as its own court. Members could only be tried by other members of that court, tried by other members of those peers. And of course, the explicit mantra of the Order of the Golden Fleece was not for amusement nor for recreation, but the purpose that praise shall be given to God in the very first place, and to the good glory and high renown. It was a wholly Catholic order, first and foremost. And when we enter, of course, it becomes subsumed into the Habsburg iconography. It becomes an explicitly zealous Catholic order. And of course, it was conceived originally as a crusading order. I mean, we mentioned, all of these elements of sophistication and art, coming out of the Burgundian court. One of the culminations of this is the Feast of the Pheasant. In 1454, we have the innovations in culinary arts. We see the innovations in music. All of this is put on display during the Feast of the Pheasant. But the explicit purpose of this feast, even though it would later just be seen from aesthetic reasons, was to prepare the Order of the Golden Fleece. Of course, the Order of the Golden Fleece, if anyone doesn't know, is harkening back to Jason and the Golden Fleece and the Argonauts.
Jason and the Argonauts, yeah.
This was intended again to go on reconquest. The reconquest of Constantinople was held 1 year after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. However, of course, this never materialized. Instead, the legacy we have from the Order of the Golden Fleece, from all of these rituals and ceremonies, is a model through which all of the future monarchs would want to imitate this enduring idea of chivalry. In a time where we mentioned, in the case of Agincourt, how on the battlefield these ideas are going to decline, there seems to be in the realm of politics this almost renaissance of this focus on chivalry, this idea of courtly love especially. And going back,
there's an attempt to sort of reinforce these things. I mean, at the exact same time, you have a sort of revival of these things in England. You have Chaucer, who's translating 1200s French romances into English as well, so you have an interest. And was it just a sort of happy coincidence that this people who drew all of their wealth from dealing in cloth, in some cases even cloth of gold, that the order was the Order of the Golden Fleece? I feel like that must have been a part of the decision.
that might have been a very subtle joke, but even the choice of the Order of the Golden Fleece was not without controversy due to its obviously pagan connotations, but nevertheless, maybe that was a subtle joke on behalf of Philip the Good and understanding the source of his raw power. But of course, combine these elements. What we're trying to explain here is that the opulence of the court, as Columbus said, wasn't for the sake of opulence. There was a political vehicle essentially to extend the soft power of the Dukes of Burgundy. And you mentioned, were there other examples? I mean, Marcus can probably weigh in and say that during the 9th and the 10th centuries, Constantinople was the center of soft power in Europe. From, you can say, the 13th century, France under Saint Louis was the center of soft power in Europe. And now we're seeing that locus of soft power move away from France and towards Burgundy. And of course, it won't return to France, arguably, much later, until we have the ascendancy of Louis XIV, who again is utilizing the political utilization of art to advance some style and imitation and basically set the tenor for political interaction, diplomatic interaction in Europe thereafter. But moving back onto the hard politics, because we're talking about his conscious policy to establish an empire in the Netherlands. Of course, he also, in addition to all these territories I mentioned, he purchases Luxembourg. But there are all of these ecclesiastical authorities at the same time. He can't acquire those through marriage. He can acquire those through force, but as we've seen, his methods are far more subtle than that. So instead, he places his illegitimate son on the throne of one bishopric, the bishopric of Utrecht, and he places his nephew on the bishop's throne in Liège, and he would remain the very unpopular, hated bishop of Liège until his dramatic assassination in 1482, the same year as the death of Mary of Burgundy. So at the same time, he's pursuing a religious policy at the same time as he's pursuing a policy of dynastic aggrandizement. And there's something which is seldom mentioned upon, but I want to draw here. In contrast to, can say, his bellicose, aggressive policy towards expansion in the Low Countries, the situation of France afforded Burgundy an interesting opportunity. we've been alluding to the fact that France's relationship with the papacy was incredibly fraught since Philip IV, essentially. Philip IV had basically subordinated the papacy to France in the Avignon papacy. And again, Charles V had basically supported the schism with his promotion of the anti-popes in Avignon. Built onto that, now we're having finally the Council of Constance, the Council of Basel. We're seeing the church trying to reconcile its conflicts with the conciliarist movement, essentially, and the reassertion of papal supremacy with the later Renaissance popes, Nicholas V moving through to Julius II. During this conflict, France was now in an awfully awkward position because they'd essentially lost. The Avignon papacy project had been a complete failure, and now France's international reputation had suffered because of it. Essentially, under now king since 1461, Louis XI, and even under his predecessor, Charles VII, France had been pursuing greater independence from the church. We have the Great Pragmatic Sanction in 1438, where France again tries to balance between the conciliarists and the Pope, essentially trying to undermine any ability for the Pope to control ecclesiastical appointments over France. Basically, we're seeing the emergence of the Gallican Church, which we confirmed under the reign of Francis in 1516. So we're seeing France in an incredibly fraught position with the papacy which is finally re-emerging from its Babylonian captivity. And so what does Philip do to compensate for that? He cultivates a relationship with Nicholas V and his successors. He funds various cardinals to go to Rome and basically become his advocates. He is consciously appealing to be a loyal vassal, essentially, of the Pope, at the same time that France is going in a different direction and advocating for more clerical independence.
Before we proceed any further, I just will agree with your statement about the use of soft power having gravitated from east to west. That was a statement that I think was very accurate, by the way.
And don't you also have Philip and Charles having some sort of controversy over certain towns on the Somme? They're sort of buying and rebuying them off of each other in the 1430s as well.
This is getting to Charles of Burgundy, but before we get to Charles of Burgundy, there's something which we have to address re the 100 Years' War, which is, of course, in 1435, we've been talking about his Dutch policy. We've seldom talked about his French policy because Philip was the most powerful noble in France. In 1435, having been allied with the English for 16 years, Philip switches allies. John of Bedford, his ally through marriage, has died, and he finally recognizes his former enemy, Charles VII, as King of France. Now, of course, we all know Charles VII will lead certain military innovations. He will utterly evict the English, with the exception of Calais. And he will establish, a much more accelerated process of centralization in France that we haven't seen since Philip IV. So what do you think, both of you, about Philip's decision to switch sides and the long-term ramifications of that?
Philip switching sides with the French?
Yes, Philip allying with the French against the English in 1435 with the Treaty of Arras, because he had been an ally with the English before then.
Well, I mean, this alliance didn't seem to last long. I mean, 20 years until his son's on the throne, and then everything seems to fall to pieces.
No, what I'm arguing is the significance of that. Of course, we all know it leads to a complete collapse. It's not the longevity of the alliance which concerns me, but it's more the fact that he's breaking off his alliance with the English. He's basically saying that England is lost. I will not get involved in England anymore. I will simply, recognize my enemy as the King of France, and I will be left to my own devices. I mean, I can understand the logic of Philip. Essentially, as we've seen, his policy for the last 10 years has been to expand his control over the Netherlands. I mean, you can say he's almost, he's abdicating France in a sense. He's adopting this new title, the Grand Duke of the West, to argue for his preeminence over all other nobles in France. Yet at the same time, unlike we see the relationship with Charles later, he's making no attempt to formally declare his independence from France. He is more than happy to basically be an absentee noble. He has his domains. He doesn't have to pay homage to the King of France. Yet at the same time, he's abandoning an ally, which was a very effective ally in dealing with the power of the centralized monarchy in France, which we're going to see is going to have severe ramifications when we get to the reign of his son.
Well, I mean, I suppose England is becoming more and more unstable. I mean, we're getting into Wars of the Roses territory, and so perhaps he views England as a more unreliable prospect than before.
This also with the treaty or the Congress of Arras, there's an interesting sort of dynamic which occurs here because, as you say, Philip does more or less switch from supporting the English to supporting the French. But there's the dynamic here that I find intriguing is that Philip the Good recognizes Charles VII as the King of France, but he was also exempt from homage, which is in a feudal context makes for an interesting dynamic between essentially the status of Burgundy sort of as a neighbor of France, but also as at historical times having been part of France, one way or another, and how Philip made a stringent effort to ensure that Burgundy wasn't integrated, so to speak.
Yes, and I think that more or less sort of underlines how I feel about this topic, which is that Philip is essentially wanting to resolve his situation in France, abjure his responsibility from France, so he could basically become de facto independent within his own domains, unlike the policy of his grandfather and father, who at various points had basically ruled over his region to France. Whilst we see this aggressive continuation of this policy of expansion into the Low Countries, you can say we see a complete departure from the policy of his father and grandfather, and the fact that he's not going to prosecute his vendetta against the Armagnac faction. He's going to make peace with them solely so he can continue his empire building in the East. You can say this sets the tenor for what's going to happen with Charles, but of course, unlike Charles,
I suppose war is also bad for trade, and so I mean, if he's not trying to explicitly and strongly ally himself with the French, and then he's detaching himself from the English, it looks like an attempt, it looks to me anyway, not just as an attempt to have independence, but also a sort of sense of neutrality, I suppose.
Yes, I think what I'm trying to get at is that when we have the abdication of Philip in 1465, a lot of these issues regarding the status of Burgundy have been unresolved, essentially, as a result of this switching of sides of the Treaty of Arras. The King of France is still the liege nominally of Burgundy, whilst all the other realms of Burgundy are under the supposed, vassalage of the Holy Roman Emperor. So rather than aggressively push for any clarification of this position, Philip is more or less happy to opt for this third way, this position of de facto rule, neutrality, and compensate for it with this focus on opulence and grandeur of the court, essentially. I think nothing sort of resembles this odd position that Philip has left the Duchy of Burgundy in the fact that he doesn't establish a capital. Essentially, he moves from town to town. He hosts, again, in terms of his marking the indelible effect of his authority, he comes to a town and he hosts tourneys, he hosts melees, he hosts jousting tournaments, essentially, of which he will participate in, essentially, again, this idea of chivalry, embodied through these play acts, essentially, of war. But
these are also very popular with the local merchants, by the way.
Yes, precisely.
When a monarch does a tour, it's fantastic for business when he turns up.
Yes, precisely. He's cultivating relationships. He's aiding the economy, whilst he's also exhibiting his own opulence and his own, again, chivalric persona, essentially, in front of all of his subjects. But he moves from Lille, which is of course in Belgium, he moves from Bruges, and he moves of course back to his formal capital in Dijon as the Duke of Burgundy. But he doesn't establish a permanent position of power. He doesn't establish formal institutions in the way that his son will try to do. And getting to your point, Columba, about the issue of the towns along the Somme, this is where we get to the radical departure of policy when it comes to his son, who, rather than leaving all of these issues unresolved as Philip had, he tries to make his position explicit. The irony, of course, being that Charles and Louis had been, friends, essentially. For anyone who doesn't know, because this conversation is going to be as much a discussion about Louis XI as it's going to be a discussion about Charles the Bold. Louis XI had been in revolt against his father and revolt against his brother, Charles the Duke of Berry, from 1451 essentially onwards, when he decided to marry against his father's wishes the heiress of Savoy, essentially.
And then he took refuge in Burgundy, right?
Yes, and he took refuge in Burgundy for 5 years. He basically waited out in Burgundy, cultivating a very good relationship with Charles of Burgundy, as you can see here on the left. And in 1461, he was allowed to return to France to quickly crown himself in Reims, in order to, after the death of his father, of course. So essentially, he was in open revolt against his father. But when he goes back to France, so we're talking 1461 onwards, he aggressively accelerates the policies which had been ushered in by his father to essentially centralize the kingdom under direct royal patronage. And he does so in a way which is almost in stark contrast to Philip the Good. Whilst Philip the Good went out of his way to create this zenith, this epitome of chivalry, Louis XI consciously modeled himself on a member of the ordinary bourgeoisie. He dressed down, he surrounded himself with magistrates, he surrounded himself with tradesmen. He focused on the construction of roads, he focused on the cultivation of the French economy, essentially. He even tried to undermine the aristocracy by allowing them essentially to partake in commerce, essentially making the lines between nobility and the third estate ever so blurred. Essentially, what Louis tried to do was almost further than what Philip IV tried to do, which was impose a managerial elite, essentially, a managerial aristocracy drawn from the third estate over France, consciously ignoring nobility as a factor when appointing people to various positions in government. He establishes a postal system. He essentially is trying to create a centralized domain, almost bypassing the nobility as a factor. Indeed, he has an incredibly hostile view on the nobility. In terms of like one of the acts of hostility, one of his other rivals, other than Charles the Bold, is Louis the Duke of Orleans, one of the premier nobles of France, who will eventually succeed him as Louis XII after the death of his son Charles. In order to try and
I hate these things. I was just going to say that you see similar developments in England later, especially under the reign of Edward IV. Whenever he has dinners and feasts and parties, he gives equal pride of place to the London merchants to the nobles. I think he also established a postal service too. So there you go.
Yes, but Edward IV, of course, has quite a hostile relationship diplomatically with Louis. But nevertheless, I forgot the point I was making now. I remember. Going back to Louis d'Orléans. Louis d'Orléans was married to the younger daughter of Louis, Joan. Joan, who to history is either recorded as being barren or being a hermaphrodite, with the explicit purpose, essentially, of trying to exterminate that branch of a contentious royal dynasty, essentially. I mean, he essentially wanted to, carry on the policy of Agincourt, which was essentially the obliteration of the nobility in France, so he could consolidate all power under him personally. So in stark contrast to this, you have Charles, who is very much an aesthete. He continues in the mold of his father, albeit far more in a martial manner, with less opulence and extravagance. He's very stringent in terms of finances. He focuses on state building. He focuses on the creation of a new military, rather than ignoring the developments in France. He imitates France in the sense that he establishes the Burgundian army with its own artillery corps to mirror that of France. And in terms of going back to your original point, Columba, which is the issue of the towns, one of the last acts of Philip of Burgundy when he was still in power was to cede territory in the Vermandois to Louis. And the response essentially was a violent falling out with Charles, who believed this is inviolable territory of the Duchy of Burgundy, and you're weakening us, for the sense of trying to, avoid conflict with France, essentially. So after the cautious, peaceful, neutral policy of Philip the Good, the minute Charles is, afforded the reins of power in 1465 after the abdication of his father, he embarks on an incredibly bellicose foreign policy, aiming to retrieve those territories and to ally with all of the rebellious nobles in France to undermine Louis and his attempt to centralize and bypass them entirely. And this is called the League of the Public Weal. This conflict is quite decisive. I mean, Louis is forced
very quick
to
as well. Very
Yes.
quick after. I mean, he's given power by his father in was it the 12th of April in 65, and then within the space of 2 months, he's already won a battle against the French. So he moves very quickly.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's a reason he's known as Charles the Bold, albeit we'll find out it's not all a beneficial honorific.
No.
And he forces Louis and the nobles, this alliance, to make immediate concessions to reverse some of these centralizing reforms, and again, pivotally restoring these towns along the Rhone. But again, Charles, in his conception of rulership, from the outset believes that he is not bound by the Treaty of Arras. So he essentially believes that, for all intents and purposes, he may not be called a king, but he is an independent monarch. Of course, Louis has the complete opposite position. He believes that Charles is still his vassal, and that his act is, essentially treasonous, and he will actually call him in front of the Paris Parlement, to answer for his crimes against France. And of course, Charles responds by sending in an army. He revives the League of Public Weal again in 1468, this time allying with Edward IV of England, and again formalizes that alliance through marriage.
Yes, I think previously before he was going to get married to Anne, Louis's daughter, but then he didn't want to. He wanted to get married to Margaret of York, who was the daughter of Richard, Duke of York.
Yes.
So he was always eyeing an alliance with England.
Yes, he had been married. He basically, as a result of the Treaty of Arras, Charles VII had been very cautious about Burgundy expanding too much outside of France. So there was a stipulation in the Congress of Arras that the Burgundian house couldn't marry outside of France. They had to marry a French noble, essentially. So Charles was married to French nobles, essentially, noblewomen. The second produced his only surviving child, Mary Burgundy. When again he becomes the Duke of Burgundy, effectively in 1465, albeit he doesn't inherit the title until 1467. This is one of, again, the rebellions against France, in that he chooses to marry outside of France. He doesn't choose to marry Anne and continue his father's policy of essentially neutrality or appeasement towards France.
Yes, and not only that, but he's marrying into their oldest enemy.
Yes, exactly. He's explicitly trying to revive the embers of the 100 Years' War, consciously. And to further bolster this, Charles has also made a Knight of the Garter as well, which is seen as, again, another attack, a symbolic attack on Louis XI and his attempt to impose centralized rule in France.
It's also a good example of how again these sorts of chivalric ideas and these ideas of splendor also serve very real diplomatic uses as well.
Yes, exactly. And of course, we see this throughout history, the affording of, foreign monarchs, even today, foreign monarchs, various titles, various epithets, orders. Again, it's something which is almost become trite. I would say has become trite at this point.
Yes.
But in those days, in the 15th century, it had real political significance in a way which it doesn't today. But of course, Burgundy is just as fragile as France is, if not more so. Charles rules over a patchwork kingdom. And so Louis responds to the League of Public Weal by fomenting rebellion in Liège. And what is characteristic of Charles is that Charles is utterly brutal to those who resist his rule. So he comes in and basically massacres the city of Liège.
I think the reason for this is that in the previous battle that had happened in June, just after the first war of the Public Weal, it was at the Battle of was it Monthengon, or how do you say it?
I don't have it in front of me.
I think it's Monthengon. It's the first battle that he fought in the Public Weal, and then he forced the concessions from Louis. But essentially, a rumor reached the city of Dinan that Charles had lost the battle, and then the people in the city really didn't like him, and so they started celebrating. They burned him in effigy, and they said that his mother had slept with the previous bishop and that he was actually a bastard. And so when he turned up to the town, he supposedly killed everyone, men, women, children, just totally sacked the place. So he had a real real ruthless streak, to say the least.
Yes, and you mentioned bastardy. I think that's important to bring up as well, because Charles was the only legitimate child of Duke Philip of Burgundy, and he was famous for having one of his bastards. One of his bastards, in particular, Anthony, the so-called Great Bastard, was a preeminent member of the Order of the Golden Fleece and one of the loyal generals and essentially vassals of Charles the Bold, essentially. So this idea of bastardy would have had some political implication because of the licentiousness of his father, essentially. But more than we're talking about the martial and diplomatic overtures of trying to declare independence from France. But what I was trying to illustrate about Philip the Good is that Philip the Good, despite his opulence, essentially, did very little in the way of establishing common institutions. In the last year of his reign, we see the creation of an Estates General of Flanders, Brabant, and Holland. And this is going to be the precursor for the modern Estates General we see in the Netherlands. There is an ancient continuity going all the way back to the to Philip the Good. And again, this is based on the same supposition we talked about in our last stream. What was the Estates General there for? The Estates General, from the point of view of the monarch, was there to be used as a gathering to procure a feudal due, feudal support from the estates to support a war effort in particular. But from the point of view of the estates, they believed it to be an institution for which they could establish their own privileges into perpetuity. We saw the height of the Estates General during the regency of the Dauphin Charles, later Charles V. And here, this institution would later basically implement the same policy after the death of Charles in 1477. But in addition to the creation of the Estates General, which had been created under his father, in 1473, we have the creation of the Parlement at Mechelin, which, again, in imitation of the Paris Parlement, was supposed to be this supreme authority regarding royal legislation and royal justice, consolidating the Conseil de Roi under basically a formal machinery of government. And again, identifying that all of these domains are not just some weird concoction patchwork nation held by one monarch. These are real indelible institutions.
Yeah, and these are all things that a king would have, right?
Yes, exactly. And consciously modeling himself in France, not only is he richer and more, you can say artistically inclined than the Kingdom of France in terms of the opulence of his court, but he is now consciously styling institutions on that of the French monarchy at the same time. He reduces his spending in some regards, yet he doesn't dilute certain organizations with major political and prestigious implications, such as the Order of the Golden Fleece. But again, there is still a problem with this. You have these attempts at creating common institutions, this attempt at creating a formalized and centralized domain. Yet at the same time, it is historically disparate. We mentioned the very ancient examples of the Kingdom of the Isle and Lotharingia in terms of precedents for this. But we're talking about a region which had been politically decentralized for nearly half a millennia at this point. There's very little in the way of a cultural integrity to these regions, nor, as you can see on this map, is there any way some form of territorial continuity, especially with the south and the north. So what does Charles do to overcome this? He's also nominally dependent on both France and both the empire. So if he was to, ever gain permanent advantage over Louis XI in his prolonged rivalry, he needed to aspire for full political independence. And this is what he conceived of, which was a kingdom, a third kingdom of Burgundy or a third kingdom of the Ararat, essentially. And as you can see, not just a kingdom in name, but territorially continuous, linking the north and the south, basically reuniting both upper and lower Lotharingia, lower and upper Lorraine, and uniting the monarchy around common symbols like the Order of the Golden Fleece, like the Cross of Burgundy, etc., creating a flag for his nation and the common institutions, all of these things essentially. And of course, Charles does this. He aggressively expands, almost to his detriment. So, utilizing his father's policy, we see the purchase of various lands in Alsace from Sigismund of the Archduke of Austria, or further Austria.
Is this not on the agreement that Sigismund can buy them back, though?
Yes, this is I'll bring that back later, because this will be his ultimate undoing, as you're no doubt aware, because it's brought back on a very specific reason, which is Sigismund wants Charles and Charles's military might to be used against the burgeoning Swiss Confederacy. And these territories are right on the periphery of the Swiss Confederacy and have been essentially raided by the cantons. So the Archduke lends these territories from his conception to Charles in order that he can fight them, essentially, and then he'll basically pay them back at a later date and give Charles, a vast amount of money for them. Of course, Charles does not do this. He doesn't see at that moment, we're talking about the early 1470s, that there is any political utility in so doing. So basically, he has cheated the Archduke out of these territories, and the Archduke will resent him and basically betray him and side, ironically, with the Swiss against him. But before we get to that point, after he basically cajoles the Duchy of Guelders into, willing him the succession, as we saw with Philip the Good and Jacqueline of Bavaria, virtually all of the Netherlands, with the exception of Frisia in the north with its particular history of independence, is now united under the House of Burgundy. Those territories which aren't formally united, such as the bishoprics of Utrecht and Liège, are basically dependent on Burgundy through the use of bishops, essentially. And so now you have a continuous territory with the exception of Lorraine, which will eventually conquer. So now he wants to be acknowledged as king. And he turns to Frederick III, he turns to Austria in order to do this. As we mentioned all the way back, after the death of Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Kingdom of the Isle had become part of the long epithet of the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Emperor was still technically the King of Burgundy, effectively. So Charles believed that there were basically two solutions for him. Either
so the emperor had the right to give
the emperor
him that title.
the emperor could bestow him the title because the emperor was still technically the King of Burgundy. So yes, there were basically two options open to him. Basically, Charles could either try and force the emperor to recognize him as his heir, in which case Charles would become the King of the Romans, or Charles could be given the title of the Kingdom of the Isles, or the Kingdom of Burgundy, essentially. And this was to be cemented by an alliance with his daughter Mary and Maximilian. Ironically, this will happen under different circumstances a few years down the line. But nevertheless, Frederick III makes a famous flight from Trier to avoid the situation. And it's often sort of the excuses made by Frederick III is that he was treated very badly by Charles the Bold. But I think it was him finally realizing the sheer scope of Charles's ambition. That Charles not only did Charles want to form an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, he wanted to eclipse him, essentially. And knowing that he could militarily. So he was in a position essentially where he could give Charles everything he wanted and then betray him, as we see with Archduke Sigismund and further Austria. So he instead turns against him. And in response, Charles invades the electorship of Cologne, tries to annex parts of the west bank of the Rhine, again, part of the ancient kingdom of Lotharingia, and he is defeated at the siege of Neuss. He's forced into making a retreat after an imperial army, which outnumbers his own force, arrives. So basically, Frederick is not only removed himself from any possible alliance with Charles, that he's actively going to, intimidate him through the use of force. So he already has his campaign against Louis XI from France. He's now alienated the Holy Roman Emperor and many members of the House of Habsburg. So now that option has basically been denied him. So Charles now essentially turns to two other allies. One is Savoy. In his essentially, Savoy and Burgundy have marital links. A potential, personal union of Savoy and Burgundy would, bolster Charles's claim to be the king of the Isles, because of course Savoy, straddles that ancient territory. In addition, he bolsters that alliance with England. And in 1475, Edward IV sets off in one of the last campaigns of the 100 Years' War, essentially. And rather than actually fight Louis, he is basically bought off by Louis at the Treaty of Piquigny.
50,000 a year to just go away, basically.
Yes. So, but despite that, essentially that was meant as a diversion. It doesn't really matter if Edward IV would have taken the throne or not. What was important is that Louis XI was otherwise occupied essentially and wasn't focusing for a moment on his arch rival Charles the Bold.
Yes, give him some breathing room.
Yes, and Charles the Bold uses that opportunity to attack one of Louis's vassals, Yolande of Anjou, one of the scions of the great house of Valois Anjou, which also controlled one of the last remnants of the Ararat in Provence. And he succeeds. He conquers the duchy, quite quickly. And I think Machiavelli is quite an interesting person to look back on, because you may say that Charles has often been lauded as an idiot, but he's following the Machiavellian principles in a very clear way. It is better to be feared than loved, as is, for example, with Liège, and when one conquers a territory, one has to establish a formal presence there, in the sense that he establishes his capital at Nancy. These are all elements which will later be used and employed by Machiavelli's The Prince, essentially. So he's not an idiot. He has a very conscious military strategy. However, he is also very prone to alienating his allies, which of course will prove fatal for him.
Yeah,
so
spreading himself very thin.
From I was just going to say, from a strategic standpoint too, Charles at this point has really hemmed himself in, because he has his dispute and his difficulties with his, the relationship with France, because he's attempting to sort of, as you've alluded to, Apostolic, make himself essentially sort of a second king, either next to France or as a part of France, or next to France. And now with this disagreement with the emperor, who, as a Caligula Bushman said, the emperor jumping out of a window and fleeing, he alienated the emperor to his east. So despite the overtures to Savoy to the south, he's very much hemmed in from a strategic standpoint.
Yes, precisely. And this is the culmination of all of this political failure on the part of Charles to cultivate these relationships. Essentially, he's in a position now where, without some form of reprieve with Louis or reprieve with the emperor, he can only achieve his goal of creating a kingdom through military force, and that is what he essentially embarks on. So, going back to that thing you alluded to earlier about the issue of the lands in Alsace, the lands of Alsace, of course, were basically pawned to Charles so he could attack the cantons. When that didn't happen, the Archduke sided with the cantons, and the cantons basically invaded Burgundy, and they defeated Charles at Héricourt very quickly. And we see the alliance of basically a confederation of cities, the cantons, under the city of Bern, essentially. And
are the Swiss troops at this point? They're not pikemen. These would be long swordsmen, I would assume.
No, these are pikemen. This is, you can say,
so they're coming into the Rhone already.
Yes, the grand arrival of Swiss pikemen onto the scene. We see it at Héricourt, at Grand-Saint-Maur, and Nancy. And if it's possible, because we're getting to Grand-Saint at the moment, so just to set that up, the Swiss then attack the lands of Savoy. I think a lot of people have mischaracterized this as Charles basically declaring war on the Swiss. No, Charles blundered into a war in which the Swiss took a preemptive strike, and they launched that strike at Héricourt, and then they invade the Verdun region around Geneva, which of course was part of the County of Switzerland then, and of course will then become formally part of Switzerland, ceded from Savoy.
Sorry, Apostle, just to mention, just for the sake of the chat, the important thing about Héricourt as well is that it's not just a battle is fought there, but they actually invest and take the town of Héricourt, which opens up basically the southern portions of Charles's kingdom very quickly to the Swiss.
Yes, absolutely. And the response by Charles is to invade Switzerland. And so he invades through the town of the Grandson in Switzerland, and then he encounters a unexpectedly formidable Swiss army. Marcus, would you like to explain what essentially happened at Grandson?
Yeah, sorry, just got to get my notes. Just 2 seconds. Well, I actually only just read about this in preparation for the stream, because I didn't know a whole lot about the Burgundian Wars, but the Grandson's an interesting sort of battle insofar that it's sort of partially it's partially sort of a naval battle, and partially a land battle, where the forces of Charles besieged the castle at Grandson, which is on the lake of Neuchâtel, and the sort of coalition that the Swiss Confederacy attempt to sort of reinforce their garrison, but there's actually a misunderstanding between the naval component and the garrison, because the naval forces were very wary of the Burgundian guns, because Charles, for all of his failings, he actually did. His forces were actually quite interesting insofar that he would have a mercenary contingent and sort of his own domestic sort of contingent of Burgundian troops. He did invest in cannon, and actually the previous battle at Héricourt and also at Planta, the Burgundians are some of the first people in Europe to actually use sort of very primitive handguns. So the Burgundian army, despite its sort of size, is quite technologically advanced, and he actually even hires.
I bet handguns must have been so dangerous at this point.
the trope from this period was not really trope because it's kind of true, but the for handgunners, in the first sort of 50 years in their usage, they were as much as a hazard to the users as they were to the person at the wrong end of the barrel.
Yeah, I'd prefer a sword personally. Blow up in your hand. Yeah.
But Charles would also hire sort of English bowmen, the English longbows. He would also even hire Italian crossbowmen as well, for garrisons. I mean, Charles was not lacking in sort of imagination in terms of deploying a very sort of intriguing sort of combined arms force. But I guess his problem was that he almost never had enough troops, and he was always fighting many enemies at once. So going back to grandson anyway. So the Confederacy are very wary of the Burgundian heavy cannon and are reluctant to sort of challenge them and to send their relieving troops into the city. They attempt to signal each other, but the garrison themselves misunderstand it and surrender to Charles. So Charles succeeds in capturing the town, but the Swiss nonetheless still attempt to attack him, not realizing that the garrison itself has surrendered. I have to say I don't know too much about the battle in a tactical context, but the Swiss, if you read about how the Swiss sort of fight in this time, they tend to sort of march in a really interesting sort of like oblique echelon sort of way when they sort of attack an enemy, and so the first echelon of Swiss advance upon Charles's troops, which he sort of attempts to surround, and the majority of the casualties are inflicted upon the Swiss in this first phase. But it's when the second and third echelons strike the Burgundian positions that Charles's army basically routs, because they don't actually realize that, although their numbers are comparable, they don't actually realize that there's only the three echelons attacking them. They believe that there's actually more contingents arriving, and even though Charles is sort of riding up and down the line attempting to rally his troops, it's to no avail. Although the casualties are actually fairly light in this battle part of the grandson conflict, the Burgundians have approximately 20,000 troops, and the Swiss have about 21 to 22,000. But the Swiss only lose about 100 men, and that's in that first phase when the Burgundians attempt to encircle the first echelon, and Charles loses about 1,000 men. But it's more grandson kind of in some ways is kind of like the Burgundian Manzikert, that the battle itself isn't itself decisive and not a lot of troops are lost, but there's a decisive turn in the momentum of the conflict of the Burgundian Wars, and it's really from grandson onwards that Charles, unable to take the initiative, is very much on the back foot hereafter.
So when you say sorry, I was just going to ask about these echelons, because I've heard about this. Does that essentially mean that you would have, as opposed to a long line, and you advance your line, the Swiss are attacking in columns? You sort of have the three columns, and they attempt to break the enemy line and then come round behind. Is that what you're describing?
Well, the Swiss halberds, which would often protect the pikemen, because as we've seen, say when we've talked about, say, like the Macedonians and the phalanx, a phalanx is very liable to be flanked, and if flanked, is almost made sort of redundant as a formation. But they would often march very much in column formation, then sort of deploy their pikes, and the halberds and sort of Zweihandlers would sit in between the ranks in order to prevent disintegration of their sort of pike formation. But it's in the sort of Charles's army is sort of surprised because these sort of columns keep marching, and in some ways a column can almost sort of look larger than a battle line. And when sort of three columns hit Charles's line, his troops are thinking that there's more columns arriving, but there's only the three columns.
Yeah, because it's typically a traveling formation, a column. So they would assume that if they're marching in this boldly, they would have reserves somewhere. But
ballsy
Swiss, huh?
Yeah, Sonos Hamar makes a very good point about it. It's interesting how a heterogeneous combined arms force is defeated by a homogeneous pike army. Yeah, I guess it's one of those instances where the at the tactical level and elements of surprise and sort of the intangibles matter more than you might say the prima facie qualities of a fighting army. That really Charles is kind of undone as a matter of circumstance, rather than any sort of inherent deficiency within his own army.
Yes, and I think there's also he's basically having to constantly reappraise the tactical situation in the face of this new enemy. So as I believe, this also signifies the end of the French heavy cavalry essentially as an effective force, because he uses the cavalry against the pikemen. Of course, anyone knowing now know that's an utterly disastrous move, to attack walls of heavy pikes of cavalry. Nevertheless, as we've seen with the effects of the longbow at Agincourt, at Crécy, at Poitiers, combine that now with the new pike tactics, you can say that this really is the final death knell for the effective use of cavalry, even though, as we mentioned, cavalry wasn't just the essential component of the army, as it had been with the previous French armies, that he had relied on this interesting conception of combined tactics, and was innovating in the sense that he was using handguns and using artillery.
And one last point just on the pike tactics too. Unlike, say, the experiment with pikes, or a more primitive use of pikes, say, as we say the Flemish militias, the Swiss pikes are more heavily armored. They're sort of more able to withstand, fire from bows and not necessarily crossbows, but just being armored themselves, at least to some degree, they are less liable to be less vulnerable to sort of fire from indirect troops, being in this case primarily bowmen. It makes them rather more solid as a sort of a fighting force.
So thank you very much for that, Marcus. Now getting up to the culmination of all this, where history from this point on changes dramatically, and this is one of the unsung sort of moments where had this fate essentially been different, then the history of Europe would have probably been irreconcilable, which is the defeat of Charles and the death of Charles at the Battle of Nancy. Nancy, of course, had been the center of his political operation, against the Swiss, and he had, of course, deposed the Lorrainian Duchess Yolande and her husband, René II. René II, now combined with the Swiss forces, arrive with a vengeance, and as far as I'm aware, decisively outman Charles at the Battle of Nancy, and of course his force is almost entirely wiped out. And of course, he struggles in the battle. And before getting into the tactics, of which I'm only sort of faintly familiar, there was one quote from the battle towards the end of his life: "I struggle against a spider who is at once everywhere." And to my mind, that's almost like a subtle allusion to Louis XI, of course, is renowned as the universal spider. That it's the long prevarications, the long arm of Louis and his scheming and his direct influence, which is bringing all of these enemies to bear essentially on Charles.
I can't remember. Did we cover when Louis comes to Charles's camp to negotiate and essentially puts himself in Charles's hands?
Oh yes, that's quite a lot earlier. That's during the League of the Public Weal regarding the Somme. This is 10 years later or so.
Yes, but very, very interesting. He boldly comes along without any guard and negotiates in Charles's camp, sort of hoping or assuming that Charles will be restrained by these notions of chivalry. And sure enough, Charles, I think Charles even found out whilst he was negotiating with Louis that Louis had fomented another rebellion in Liège. He found out whilst he had him, and he still let him go, which
yes, exactly
shows that chivalry is still strong.
For Charles, not for Louis.
yeah.
Just one thing to take into account. I don't know to what degree you want to actually cover the Battle of Nancy, but there's the difference here, say, to Granson, is that at Granson he's able to sort of deploy the entirety of his fighting force against the Swiss, and even though he loses at Granson and there's a rout, his forces are mostly intact. But at Nancy he's outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. And Nancy actually holds out, so he suffers that conundrum of having to keep troops facing the city so the garrison doesn't flank him, but at the same time he's beset not only by the force of René II, Duke of Lorraine,
the Duke of Lorraine is also assisted by as many as 8 to 10,000 Swiss sort of mercenaries, which are sent by the cantons to assist him. And so Charles really has his back to the wall, both literally and figuratively, at the Battle of Nancy.
And not only the forces of his enemies, but the forces of nature as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. A besieging army that doesn't succeed in taking a city is always going to be liable to, to supply problems and sort of famine if it gets so bad, which sort of Charles's army was on the brink of at this stage.
But I was of the understanding that it was also extremely cold. I mean, that's how Charles met his end.
Well, this was in the middle of was the beginning of January, so yeah.
Because
Switzerland,
because he attacks sort of Nancy in the hope that he can do sort of, you might say, a surgical strike, like a quick strike, take the city, and in winter hope that enemy forces won't be rallied against him, because as we all know, in European warfare, traditionally sort of summer is and the spring is the fighting season. But this fails, and despite his assumptions in his failure to take Nancy, he's set upon, the battle actually occurs on the 5th of January, so just in the new year. So you're talking in the midst of winter, and his enemies use the opportunity to actually attack him, and in failing to take Nancy, him and his troops are highly vulnerable.
So you can say he meets a thoroughly predictable end, and of course, rather
than a gruesome one at that.
Rather than managing to escape, he's killed and mutilated on the battle, and the Lorrainers, celebrate the fact that they have regained their independence, and the Swiss, of course, have defeated their principal enemy in the Burgundian Wars. In a sense, they have ended in the sense of direct Swiss and Lorrainer involvement. Their political achievements have been attained. But now we move on to the intervention of the Universal Spider, because as we've been at pains to mention regarding reversion of territories, regarding French Salic law, of course, Charles had no male heir. He had a female heir, Mary of Burgundy, and Louis XI now seizes upon this opportunity to declare, as with the death of the Capetian Duke Philip in the 1360s, that the territories which had been de jure part of France, so on this map, namely the Duchy of Burgundy itself, Artois, Picardy, etc., were essentially forfeit from Mary and had to be returned to the king. And in order to ensure that, he occupies those provinces, accepting the fact that now the Burgundian armies have basically been wiped out. Now, Mary is in an almost impossible position. Not only has she lost essentially her French inheritance, but the Liégeons and Gelders, which have been basically forced into a succession ploy by Charles, immediately declared their independence from Burgundy, essentially. So she's basically forced into a position where she accepts the so-called, I'll move on to the next slide, the so-called great privilege to shore up what is left of her ever dwindling domain. This is a summoning of the Estates General, which had been created, only a decade prior. And the Estates General imposes upon her a set of conditions to unravel the centralizing efforts which had been embarked on by Charles. So the Mechelin Parlement, which had tried to create a centralized system of administration legislation, is dissolved. The emphasis here is that the Dutch cities, in particular Ghent, especially, which will often, harass and execute her advisors, etc. The population of Ghent want to assert their own right to appoint their own officials, have their own customs, etc., their own privileges. So any attempt at centralizing, any authority which can impose, governors on them, etc., has to be vetoed, essentially. And this is pervasive throughout the Great Privilege. In addition to this, you have the imposition of an estates-backed council to essentially advise her. And in addition to, what you can say, establishing the principles of constitutional monarchy, she's basically deprived of her right to levy taxes. The estates are afforded that permanent right. She's not allowed to wage war without the consent of the estates, nor is she allowed to marry, essentially, without the consent of the estates, because now the inheritance is a major political consideration. And from this, she's able to retain the bulk of her inheritance, essentially. Most of the Low Countries.
But through sort of dissolving her power. I mean, it's something that you see a lot when you'll have a female ruler come along, especially a young one, is that,
she's only 19 at this point, yeah. She's 19 at this point. Her father's army has been deposed. She's having to deal with the political consequences of her father's attempt at centralization and failure to create a kingdom. However, she has one point in her favor, which is that the estates, especially the estates in Flanders, which is still the center of Burgundian power, and we're mentioning the major cities, Bruges and Ghent, are all in Flanders. They are very concerned about the French coming back and trying to impose authority, because they're looking at Louis's example of how he took Picardy, of how he took Artois, of how he took Bourgogne itself. So they are very anxious for a advantageous marriage, basically importing someone who can defend the realm against further encroachments by France and to preserve the integrity of Flanders in particular, because it's very unlikely that Louis would have been able to occupy, the imperial possessions en masse. Very unlikely. So she is basically, advised to marry the person who she potentially could have married some 4 years earlier, which is Maximilian, the King of the Romans, the heir to Frederick III von Habsburg. And this is a very successful marriage. Maximilian, using the combined forces of Burgundy and the Austrians, is able to halt the French advance at Cunigat in 1479. However, unfortunately for Mary, despite these initial gains, and as we see the consolidation of a political position, of course, the Habsburgs begin to nullify many of the effects of the Great Privilege and centralize their domain. And you could say this is the beginning of the causes of the 80 Years' War in the next century, as we see the Habsburgs, again, like the Burgundians, trying to establish a centralized authority, albeit they're not claiming, Burgundy or Lotharingia. We're now talking about the Netherlands as a distinct political entity. She dies at the age of 25 during a horse riding accident where she is basically tipped into a ditch and breaks her back. Fortunately for her house and for her husband, she has already produced Philip the Fair, who would later become the King of Spain and produce Charles V. And she has produced a daughter, Margaret. And her husband is in a powerful enough position where he is able to be made regent, essentially, of Burgundy, whilst Philip is waiting out his minority, essentially. And right after this, so after the tragic premature death of Mary of Burgundy, after she and Maximilian had shored up the independence of the Netherlands against the French, the French are brought to the negotiating table at another Congress of Arras, whereby France formally takes control over Ducal Burgundy and Artois and Picardy, but crucially not Flanders. Flanders had been able, through this process, to attain what it wanted, which is its formal political independence from France. And Flanders, which had been part of France since, as we see on this map, since the conception of West Francia as a nation back in 843, Flanders, for the first time in 700 years, is now permanently, essentially severed from France. France, the French kings will appeal to some sort of claim over Flanders, but they will never be able to exert it. So from here on out, even the geography of France as we know it has changed. And ironically, France has lost de jure territories; it hasn't gained them. And I would say the great irony of this is the great lost opportunity. This is something because Louis XI, the universal spider, who finally defeated his opponent through guile, if not through direct military action, would lament this for the rest of his life, which that year, 1477, was crucial in the sense that had he opted for a conciliatory policy towards Mary, had he decided not to impose his rights on her territories so forcefully, had he, for example, understood the political power of the Flemish estates, and had he tried to marry, say, the Dauphin Charles, who was much younger, and again, this is something he desperately attempted, to Mary, then there is an attempt that all of these possessions could have gone back to the House of Valois. Of course, he doesn't opt for that policy. He opts for the military conquest and marriage on top of that, which of course the Estates General reject entirely because they are terrified about the centralizing measures which have been undertaken very aggressively by Louis. So Louis, in many ways, is both the victor and the loser of this.
And of course, generations later, or a couple of generations later, once you have Charles Charles V, the descendant, you have a realm which rises to be the absolute terror of France.
Yes, we are. What we're doing is setting up basically the context for next week's stream, where we go over the rise of the Habsburgs and the creation of the Habsburg Empire, which you can say overshadows France at a point where France should be supreme post the 100 Years' War. Again, the ebb and flow of history, essentially. There is one
also at the same time, do you not you have Duke Francis of Brittany die without an heir as well?
Well, this gets into a point I was just about to discuss, so that's quite prescient, which is that Margaret, the daughter of Mary, now dead, is essentially married by proxy to the Dauphin Charles, and as a dowry, Maximilian basically permits that the free county of Burgundy, as you can see on this map, the southeastern part, is basically given over to France as a dowry. Now, when Charles finally reaches his majority, he does something which is very reckless. He compromises that peace treaty. He marries Anne of Brittany, the heiress of Brittany, over Margaret of Burgundy, therefore forswearing his inheritance to the Free County of Burgundy, but gaining Brittany in the process. And as a result, both Burgundy under Habsburg rule and France are now again on the precipice of war, because the issue of the succession is still enduring. And this is where we have the Treaty of Senilly, whereby basically the borders renegotiated again, and this time it's quite favorable to the Habsburgs in Burgundy. They regain territories such as Artois, and the Free County of Burgundy, which had been a dowry for the marriage, again is given back to the Habsburgs and will remain Habsburg until the reign of Louis XIV, some 200 years later, just to illustrate the implications of this treaty and how it will fundamentally shape European geopolitics going forward from here. And of course, moving on to another stream, which we're hosting in 2 weeks' time, Charles VIII is offering these concessions with a concerted political goal, which is that he wants to expand his domains into Italy, and he wants the emperor to be independent. So basically, he wants to resolve any lingering issues, with the Burgundian succession, in order that he has a free hand to deal with his claims in Italy. And
so
of course,
this leads into the Italian Wars.
Yes, so this leads quite nicely into our two streams over the next 2 weeks. But before we finish, there are just a couple of things to illustrate, which is the remainder, what happened to the remainder of these territories, because we've been talking about the main sort of focus of the story, which is the House of Valois Burgundy, and the failed attempt to create some sort of resurrection of that middle Burgundian, of that middle Frankish state, the state of Burgundy, the state of Lotharingia, which we had illustrated at the beginning of this stream. The other major family which had possessions in these territories, namely Provence, and namely Lorraine, was the House of Anjou. First of all, you had the Capetian House of Anjou, and then you had the House of Valois Anjou in a similar predicament which we saw with Burgundy. In 1481, at the same time that this was all going on, the County of Provence, which was still technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, was bequeathed to Louis XI after the extinction of the House of Valois Anjou. For anyone who's interested, the penultimate ruler of Valois Anjou, the so-called Good King René, was one of, the preeminent nobles in France. He ruled over Anjou, he ruled over Lorraine, he ruled over Bar, he ruled over Verdun, he ruled over Provence, and at one point he was also ruler over Naples, and had a claim on the throne of Aragon at the same time. Yet towards the end of his life, his entire patchwork domain again was unraveling in a similar fashion to Charles, and Louis, rather than wait around for his death, was forcefully annexing territories such as Anjou, and in the end Louis was able to procure basically the inheritance of Provence as well. So with that, any sort of political independence of the Arelate kingdom is gone forever, and the vast amount of that territory, namely Lyon, Ducal Burgundy, the Free County eventually, Dauphin, and the County of Provence, are all given over to France. There is a remnant of political independence, but it's not going to be from that remnant of the Kingdom of Burgundy. It's going to be the Papal Enclave in Avignon, which will last until the French Revolution in 1792. or rather the effects of the Revolutionary Wars in 1792. And there is one sort of saving grace for this, which is the independence. The right in the center of here, which is Lorraine. Lorraine, that last little remnant, that titular remnant of Lotharingia. Of course, Lorraine is a derivative of that. René II, the victor of Nancy, the vanquisher of Charles the Bold, would establish from the House of Valois-Anjou a dynasty, a ducal line that will rule Lorraine as an independent duchy for the next 300 years until the duchy is finally incorporated into France during the reign of Louis XV. So what we're basically illustrating here is the utter sort of disintegration of this power between the center. The Netherlands, even though it will be reorganized as a new political entity, which will form the basis of a future stream, it is still part of the Holy Roman Emperor and ruled over directly by the Holy Roman Emperors forthwith after the House of Burgundy finally sort of catches up to the House of Habsburg. So yes, unless anyone has anything else to say about the fate of the awkward middle countries between France and Germany, we can get onto the super chats.
No, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. Let's move on.
Wonderful. So just to get onto the super chats. Sorry, YouTube is taking a little bit of time to load.
Actually, just while you're searching for the super chats, I'll make a point of just thanking our viewers that we have tonight. Good on them for sticking around.
Yes, they are now part of our Order of the Golden Fleece.
They're not trucks. They are the highest of tens. So thank you, everyone.
The Imperial Bodyguard.
And for those of you out there, actually, there is one point I want to make. For those of you out there, there were between 30 and 50 members, permanent members of the Order of the Golden Fleece. So our number is very appropriate in that sense.
There we go. See, coincidence? I think not.
No, so you are all members of our own little Order of the Golden Fleece. But there is one little point of historic irony to mention, which I'm sure was on the mind of Louis XI before he died in 1483, which is that the Swiss mercenaries have been essential to the collapse of the political authority of Charles. So the response of Louis is to disband his own royal guards and replace them with Swiss mercenaries, who will guard him and guard the French dynasty, the Valois and later Bourbon dynasty, all the way up until the Guards is annihilated during the French Revolution. So you can say the effect of the Burgundian defeat at the hands of the Swiss has a very long effect throughout history, reverberating through to the French Revolution.
Yes, I mean, you have, of course, the famous Swiss Guard of the papacy as well. They become widely desired all across Europe.
Absolutely.
It's through this period, so you might say that the Swiss really begin to make a name for themselves in a military kind of context. In regards to, like you say, the various bodyguards, whether it's the Papal Guard or the French Guard, they really make a name for themselves in these series of wars and battles.
Absolutely. So onto the super chats. Judge Caligula Bushman for €5. Thank you very much. Just wondering if you are familiar with Huizinga's classical work on the Burgundian dynasty, The Lands of the Waning of the Middle Ages. Now, I have read a book, The Autumn of the Middle Ages, if that's a derivative, and I actually use that in consultation for my little assessment of the court of Philip of Burgundy. So if that is the same book, I'm not sure. I'll be very surprised if there were two books which had such a similar name written by the same author. Then yes. Oh yes, and your subsequent super chat, Judge Caligula Bushman for €2. Waning, also known as the Autumn of the Middle Ages. So yes.
There you go. Yeah.
John Gordon for $10. Thank you very much, John Gordon. What exactly was Austria's diplomatic stance on Burgundy during Philip and Charles the Bold's reign? I know Burgundy was within the Holy Roman Empire, but did this cause strife between the two? Well, we've talked about how it did indeed cause strife between Charles the Bold and Austria. However, before then, during the reign of Philip the Good, and explicitly during Philip the Bold, Philip II, 100 years before, there had been a very conscious attempt by the House of Burgundy to cultivate positive relations with the Holy Roman Emperor, for the obvious reason that the House of Burgundy was expanding into the Holy Roman Empire. So essentially they wanted imperial acquiescence to force all of these territories, which will later become the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to become part of the Burgundian royal realm, essentially. So a good, even though the Austrians weren't the Holy Roman Emperor during a large part of that, they were still a major dynasty which had to be reckoned with, especially as they controlled land to the east of Burgundy in Alsace, essentially, and in Swabia still. If that answers your question.
So you might
John
describe
Gordon.
their approach as opportunistic.
I would say I would give them more sort of credit than saying opportunistic. I would say Philip the Bold establishes a pattern of expansion in diplomatic relations, which were very fortuitous for the House of Burgundy. Had there been no marriage at Cambrai in 1385, there would likelihood be no Burgundian Netherlands. You know, he established a policy 50 years before it would pay off, and it paid off, you know, with complete success under the reign of his grandson. So I think in that sense he was incredibly far-sighted in a way that Charles the Bold was not.
No, I mean, it's amazing to see Charles the Bold sort of expend all of that capital that had been built up by the previous rulers. You know, you had such wise administration.
Well, there is something I'll give to that, which is because I mean Charles the Bold, you know, he had a sort of monastic life post his marriage, essentially, even when he was married to Margaret of York. Unlike his father, who was, he was a bit of a womanizer, to put it nicely, and patronized his bastards publicly at court. Charles, for the most part, had very little interest in sex. And as a result of that, you know, there was no chance that he was going to produce an heir well into his 40s. And one of the reasons there was such a rush to create, and as someone is saying in the chat, he had many, many, many mistresses, in addition to be married to a scion of the King of Portugal, again fomenting that ancient Burgundian link with the House of Portugal and the Capetian House of Burgundy. But one of the reasons I believe there was such a rush by Charles to unite the King of Burgundy by force is because had he been able to do so, had he been able to create common institutions, an effective army, a continuous territory, i.e. resurrecting Lotharingia or Middle Francia or the Aralat or whatever, he could have basically solidified his daughter's reign. Essentially, he could have made her the, you know, uncontested successor and not had to rely on reversion or French Salic law, etc. So the irony is, I mean, had she married into the House of Habsburg and had he been made King of Burgundy, history would have played out actually quite similar to how it did, which is that the Habsburgs would have taken over Burgundy and they would have inherited the incredibly wealthy and prosperous position. The only exception probably is that the Habsburgs would have been in a more advantageous position than they ended up being post the Burgundian succession crisis.
So I suppose in a sense he had no choice but to be bold, at least to some extent.
Yes, exactly. So you can say, you know, Habsburg domination of the Netherlands was in some way inevitable, but Charles could do something, if anything, to establish his own posterity in history, because his line was going to end with him, unless he, you know, for example, you know, legitimized one of his bastard half-brothers, which was probably very unlikely.
Probably not very appealing, no.
Well, the ironic thing is that I believe Anthony, the grand bastard, he was
grand bastard. I know it's so childish, but I shouldn't laugh.
Was actually legitimated by, I think it was Louis XII, because he lived a very long time. I think he was 80 when he died. So he was actually finally legitimated long after the Burgundian threat was over. So it's possible, you know, if a king of France would legitimate the half brother of your mortal enemy, then you could have been legitimated and your line could have carried on. But I mean, we have been talking so often as, you know, illegitimate lines trying to pass off legitimate lines and succession wars, etc., that, you know, anything was possible had he established a position of political and military preeminence throughout Europe, which of course was a complete failure. John Boy for €10, no question. Just thank you to AM and Columba and Furious for another enlightening stream. Well, thank you very much, John Boy, for that. That does mean an awful lot.
Thank you, sir.
and again, I know quite a lot of you have gone over to watch AA this evening, but for those of you who want something, completely different, then hopefully this has been somewhat educational. It's a part of history which I think is unfortunately overlooked, and I think as we've gone over the details, it is incredibly important to the economic, cultural, and political future of Europe in every sense. And I think, therefore, it's a tragedy that it is overlooked. So,
indeed, we need some snappy historical fiction to get people interested.
Suno Hamar for €10. Thank you very much. Tulip budget, wonderful, thank you. Is that an allusion to the tulip boom, which is going to affect the Netherlands in a couple of 100 years? Perhaps. So yes, that's it for the end of the super chats. Thank you very much. Unless either of you want to bring up some interesting points about the fate of the almost Third Kingdom of Burgundy, we can call this an end.
No, I think that's me, guys. I think we've done a good job.
Indeed.
Right. Well, thank you, both of you. Thank you again to my wonderful patrons. There were a couple more patrons after last week's stream, which is doing rather well, all things considered. I don't think I've ever had a stream which got so many views in such a short amount of time. So thank you to everyone there. If you have any interest in becoming a patron, there is a link in the description. Thank you very much. Otherwise, do feel free to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, or leave a comment in the description. Otherwise, thank you very much again for my wonderful co-hosts, Columba and Marcus Furious Pertinax. Thank you all very much for watching, and good night.
Night, everyone.
Actually, there's one question which
at the bottom,
it's not a super chat, but it's an interesting question. Would the Kingdom of Burgundy's lingua franca be French or Dutch? It depends very much on how the conquests of Philip of Charles the Bold went. Had Charles the Bold successfully incorporated Lorraine and made Nantes his capital, which was possible from 1475 onwards, and had he used that position to expand further south into Savoy, which of course was Occitan speaking, and into maybe even invaded France again to recapture those areas of the former Alliat, then French, definitely. However, as things turned out, the remnant of the Burgundian succession, which was ensured, was the Netherlands essentially, and of course Flemish and Dutch is more prominent, essentially more spoken by more people than Wallonian. But nevertheless, I think the fact the dynasty was French speaking would have made the court at least speak French, in the same way that the court in England spoke French right up until the 15th century. So I would err towards French in both cases.
Yes, I mean it's all about identifying the sort of weight of influence in each society,
and also where the you might say the gravity or the central mass of the kingdom would lie. I mean, Apostolic mentioned it quite well. If there was a theoretical consolidation in the south of France, and middle France would be French, and as things sort of happened, there was more of a northern orientation, so therefore more lean towards Dutch. But you've seen these in history where sort of an obvious example would be East Rome and West Rome. As the empire became more East-centric and moved towards Constantinople, it sort of gradually transitioned towards Greek. I know it's a very different example, obviously, and there's less of a stark difference between cultures, but
it's the same
it just
principle.
Goes to show you, exactly. It's the principle of where the center, the critical mass, and the political orientation geographically where it's centered. So
and the capital, of course, because something we've mentioned repeatedly is that Burgundy was unable to establish a permanent centralized capital, which aided in its abolition. Of course, the ducal capital was always at Dijon, which of course is right in the heart of French-speaking territory, the Langue d'Oil. Even though we don't have a consolidated Ile-de-France French dialect being imposed everywhere. But the natural capital after that, the capital which was chosen by the Habsburgs, was essentially Brussels in the Netherlands. Of course, Antwerp would then replace Bruges as the main economic and political center. But Brussels, again, is on that cusp of French-speaking and Flemish-speaking. So even then, it's quite difficult to tell.
You'll have to ask the Wallonians.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.